Up next, officials from the Carter to the Obama administration talk about the history of the U.S. space program. Among the topics addressed are the impact of space exploration on the economy, developments in technology, national security, and the future of space exploration. This program is about 3 hours.
Dr. Strange. I was like, this just reminds me of Bill Clinton too. So, it's like his favorite. You know what happened? I knew all the lines.
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Logston. I'm the Executive Director of the TechAmerica Space Enterprise Council. Welcome to this forum focusing on national space policy. From Carter administration all the way up to the Obama administration, we have authors of every single national space policy. This is the first of its kind. This event has not been done before, and it's good timing because this may be one of the last events C-SPAN does, because we all know that the end of the world is tomorrow. So just a little bit about the Space Enterprise Council. We advocate for the advancement of space commerce in the context of why space is important to economic and national security. Why is that important right now? With the budget environment that we have, space budgets are under attack, and we believe that space is so integral and important to our nation that this has to be our message, and we bring that message out not only to the inside the Beltway crowd, but also outside the Beltway crowd, as well as a global audience. So it's my pleasure to introduce my co-host for today, Jeff Keeter. Jeff is the president of the George Marshall Institute. The Institute is one of the leading players in Washington, D.C., focusing on space security issues and space exploration issues. So, Jeff, I want to hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and thank you to TechAmerica and the Space Enterprise Council for graciously hosting this event today. And I extend my thanks and appreciation to our panelists for giving us their time this morning to come and share their experience and their expertise, their anecdotes, and their observations about the emergence and development of space policy through the years. As David said, this event is, as we think, the first of its kind. It's certainly rare and unique to have this many authors and this reservoir of knowledge about space policy here with us today. As David mentioned, space is increasingly important to U.S. national security. It's certainly important to our economic prosperity as well. And that underlies a number of programs that the Marshall Institute and the Space Enterprise Council have been hosting over the past few years, whether it's our Day Without Space series, which intends to illustrate to the common man, to the general public, the importance of space for our military prowess and our economic security, whether it's our reviews of current national space policies and the implementation of those space policies, whether it's an assessment of the health of the industrial base that provides the tools and the means by which we access space and operate there, or whether it's our focus on the commercial exploitation and the exploration of space. All of those contemporary policy issues are influenced by the history that we're going to talk about today. If you examine space policy over the long run, and the Marshall Institute has been one of the players trying to do that, if you examine that history, you find continuity. Certain core principles that were established as far back as the Eisenhower administration and the dawn of the American space age continue to resonate over the years and are present in each one of the space policies that we'll talk about today. But there are also important new issues that get added and certain areas of discontinuity that we'll certainly talk about today. So in terms of the structure of the event, as I said, we have representatives of each administration from Carter to Obama here today. We'll introduce each one of them separately, and they'll come up and share their observations and their assessments of what the space policy from their administration said, what its unique qualities or features were, how it differed from the previous administration, and how it influenced current space policy or space issues through the years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Art Morrissey, who's here representing the Carter administration. Now, of course, the Carter administration is in power during a unique period of time in the United States. You have the Iranian Revolution, which certainly influences our decision-making. You have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which reignites the Cold War period and makes the importance of U.S. national security affairs ever more important for the American public. You've got economic issues at home that certainly dog people's perceptions of the administration, as well as the ability of the government to finance the things that it would like to do. All of those things and many, many more, of course, influence various policies of the Carter administration and certainly space policy as well. So it's my pleasure to ask Art Morrissey to come up here to the podium. Art served in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy during the Carter administration, where he developed decision memoranda for the President on many national security issues, including space policy and export controls. Art?
Thank you. Well, it's interesting to be here, and thank you for the invitation to represent the Carter administration space policy in the evolution of space policy making. I'd like to thank the Space Enterprise Institute and the Marshall the Space Enterprise Council and the Marshall Institute for sponsoring this event. As I look over the audience, it's interesting to see multi-generational people that I've worked with over the years, and of course new space participants in the marketplace. It's interesting to see, and as described at the outset, the space policy generation has been an evolutionary process. The Carter administration was the first to encompass the three sectors under its umbrella of space policy: civil, space, and intelligence. And the Carter administration clearly built on the investments of decision and investments that were made in previous administrations. It would be remiss, actually, not to cite some of the more notable examples. In the Eisenhower administration, several lasting policy directives were taken. One was, of course, the freedom of space, which, of course, was the first article in the Outer Space Treaty that was subsequently agreed to. It submitted legislation on NASA, and it actually separated reconnaissance activities from the Air Force and put it under a civilian organization. The Kennedy administration, of course, is the most remembered by its decision to go to the moon and the enthusiasm to achieve that objective. The administration also consolidated intelligence and organization and activities and removed them from public scrutiny and actually placed them in the then classified organization called the National Reconnaissance Office. It also endorsed the principle of freedom of space, and outer space was free and open to all. And a seldom mentioned act that was approved during that Kennedy years was the creation of ComSat, which was a public, federally funded corporation that developed commercial communication satellites, and we have a speaker that will be subsequently working for that organization here today. The Nixon administration approved and funded the shuttle program, and it's an enduring program, and it's still operational now 30 years after its initial operational flight. The Carter administration, to highlight some of the things that were specific and influenced the immediate policy consideration, at the time when he arrived in 1977, there was unemployment at 17.5%, which is high. Federal budgets were constrained, and the Cold War was still ongoing, and competition in space was central to that equation. The Russians were the only other national recognized space power at that time. National technical means and satellites were pursued under the umbrella of intelligence programs supporting treaty verification, and tactical intelligence was just the beginning of supporting the systems capable of supporting the warfighter, which is a vernacular that's currently used. The defense and intelligence capabilities were becoming more and more recognized as valuable contributions in the arena that we played. The Space Shuttle was in development and experiencing significant cost growth that continued through the Carter administration. Two early policy decisions that were taken in the Carter administration that shaped the subsequent national policy review were decisions on the shuttle and the decision to pursue a bilateral discussion with the Soviet Union at the time to put some arms limitations on space. The first, the shuttle program, after much debate in the Carter administration, the administration decided to fund 4 orbiters, and the shuttle would be the primary access to space for NASA, intelligence community, as well as the Department of Defense. But it would be the primary access to space. The decision to enter into negotiations with the Soviet Union to ban ASAT systems was a 2-part decision. The first, of course, was to hopefully arrive at an agreement that would place some limitations on then the Soviet ASAT capability, and the second was the decision to pursue an active research and development program in the event that the negotiations were unsuccessful. The Carter administration resulted in 3 presidential directives that were released in 1978, and a lot of the material, those of you who are probably schooled in space policy, are redacted, but the fundamental aspect of the 3 policies were reflected in the National Space Policy at 37. 42 was the Civil and Further National Policy, and the Civil Operational Remote Sensing was captured in PD 54. The National Space Policy Directive established policies that would conduct the activities of space, reaffirm many of the previous administration's initiatives and directives, and added others. And some of the unclassified highlights included the rejection of claim of sovereignty, which of course we've heard before, the space systems and the right of passage without interference. Purposeful interference with space systems would be considered a infringement on sovereign rights, and the United States would pursue activities in space to support the right of national defense. The U.S. would pursue space activities in all of the application arena, civil space science, to maintain U.S. leadership in space, which was, of course, the theme and an underpinning of a space policy at that juncture. The United States would conduct cooperative space activities that benefit the United States and encourage commercial exploitation of space capabilities. Spelling out the space shuttle, NASA would be in cooperation in the development with NASA, and launch priority would be given to defense and intelligence missions. The shuttle, as I indicated, would be the primary access to space, but the U.S. would provide some EELV backups for assured access, and you'll be hearing more about that subsequently as policy evolved. And close coordination between the various sectors, which is one of the objectives of the Space Policy Review, was encouraged. Policy organization, we're asked to comment on that. It was, as I said, the first time that all of the space policy players or development organizations, NASA, NOAA, Defense Department, and the intelligence community participated. But in addition, State, ACTA, JCS, Interior, Agriculture, and Energy were also included in the participation. It was interesting, the latter 2 or 3, Interior, Agriculture, and Energy, were the first experience in space policy milieu, and it was interesting to see their participation and the contributions made. The structure included all the players with many opinions, and it's interesting to note it was surprisingly cooperative in that period. One would have thought it would have been a argumentative, jumbled competition for priorities, institutional, but in reality it turned out to be surprisingly successful. All departments and agencies were very vocal. NSC and OMB, of course, from the White House included in that discussion. But in the final analysis, the President Carter, was very involved and actually made the ultimate decisions in the direction of his national space policy. In the remaining time, I'd like to briefly highlight some of the civil and operational remote sensing policy tenets as they have continued and will be fleshed out in subsequent policy discussions as we go through the morning. There was emphasis on applications to bring important benefits to the understanding of Earth resources, climate, weather, pollution, and agriculture, a theme, of course, you'll hear again and again in other discussions as we go through the morning. An emphasis on space science and exploration in a manner to permit the nation to remain vital in its space technology base. Increased benefits to increase efficiencies across the various sectors, and assurance that the U.S. scientific and technical leadership would be continued with necessary resources for basis of later decisions to develop programs. The private sector, as I also cited earlier, was really encouraged to participate and become, in other words, the administration was advocating more roles and activity by the private sector, even at that juncture. And, of course, to foster communications, cooperation between nations. At the time, it was decided it was not feasible, necessary, to commit to a high-visible, space engineering initiative comparable to Apollo. That was a shorthand for the space station. That would come in subsequent years. The government role in remote sensing, to highlight 2 points, in land programs, NOAA was assigned the management responsibility for civil land remote sensing based on Landsat. And again, there was an encouragement at that juncture to press toward commercialization. That discussion and I wouldn't call it battle, but that discussion and pursuit continues. The weather programs, defense and commerce would coordinate but continue dual polar orbiting satellites, and not to combine them at that juncture, but steps were laid for future joint development if warranted. In science, space science and exploration, the goals were to maintain U.S. leadership in space and planetary exploration, pursue a vigorous program in planetary exploration, continue reconnaissance of the outer planets, and utilize the Space Telescope to usher in a new era of astronomy. We're asked to comment on views of accomplishments. Actually, there were several restricted initiatives and program activities that occurred. Unfortunately, I cannot evolve them, but they have been enduring and significant. I think sustaining the shuttle program, clearly the shuttle has been a significant contribution to manned operations in space. The Hubble telescope and operational land satellite programs, I think the decision to continue them and try to make them operational, and of course Hubble was started in the previous administration, but the benefits have been amazing and remarkable to the contribution of space. On the opportunities lost, I view that the inability to negotiate an arms control agreement with the Russians was an opportunity lost. With the invasion of Afghanistan of the Soviet Union late in the administration, the administration decided to withdraw from those negotiations. Since that time, there has not been a serious entertainment of any arms limitations in space since that period of time. Thank you.
So a couple notes. We are going to do the Q&A session at the very end of this program. So save your questions to the very end of the program. And when the Q&A session arrives, because we are taping this for C-SPAN, please make sure you state your name and your organization or affiliation. Thank you. So next we have the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration was marked by the Star Wars program, arms control talks, the beginning of the Space Shuttle program, and unfortunately the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. There were a few other events occurring as well, the bombing of the Beirut, American Embassy in Beirut, but a very lively area. And to discuss the Reagan administration, we had Mr. Gilbert Rye. Gil, at that time, was the Director of Space and Intelligence Programs on the National Security Council staff. in the White House. He was also the executive secretary to the Senior Interagency Group for Space, which oversaw the military, civil, and commercial sectors of the U.S. space program. It is indeed my honor to introduce Mr. Gil Rye.
Well, good morning. I'm reminded of introduction a friend of mine gave to me recently. Here's Gil Rye. He used to be somebody. I felt like I was somebody back in the golden years of the Reagan administration. We came into office under a president who was considered to be a true leader, and it was a very stimulating, exhilarating experience for me, and I'm sure my fellow panelists would agree that their period in the White House was one to remember and maybe a highlight of their career. Well, in '81, tall and handsome cowboy from California rode into the White House. He came in on a campaign, successful campaign, to demonstrate U.S. leadership in the world and to bring on a new age for setting the stage for many of the programs that he wanted to set forth. It's a fitting time, really, today, where we're a couple months away from the last shuttle flight, to travel back in time to when the shuttle began, at least when the first operational shuttle landed on July the 4th of 1982 at Edwards Air Force Base. President Reagan was there. He was there to announce his national space policy, which was really his first statement of where he stood on the space program in general and where he wanted the country to go. This was the product of almost a year-long activity to collate all of the various inputs from all of the agencies and to bring those together in a coherent way that carried on from previous administrations and set the course for the future. I had arrived at the White House about 2 months earlier and had been there only a week when Bill Clark, the National Security Advisor, brought me in to meet with the President for the first time. I sat there in awe. The National Security Advisor, Bill Clark, asked me to explain some of the things that were going on in space, and which I did. But as the meeting went on, it became clear to me the President was a little frustrated. He was frustrated that the space policy had taken so long to develop, and he was also frustrated that it didn't appear that space policy was being given enough emphasis within his administration. He wanted that changed. He wanted an organization to pull together all the sections of the space program into one coherent whole. That's what resulted in the Senior Interagency Group for Space, one of those acronyms, SIG-SPACE, that could only be invented by a bureaucrat in the U.S. government. Not as sexy as some later ones, such as the National Space Council, but nevertheless, it got the job done. It established the National Security Advisor as the chairman of the SIG-SPACE, the first time that had ever been done. It established an executive secretary, me, who's the guy who did most of the dirty work, who tried to bring the agencies together in meeting after meeting after meeting. And we tried to bring together all the aspects of space that were going on in the government. Now, that's the civil, the military, and the commercial. This was the first time that the commercial space sector had been elevated to a level equal to the military and the civil. So bringing those together, what turned out to be quite an experience. Well, the website for the George C. Marshall Institute says that the Ronald Reagan administration arguably had more focus on space and certainly issued more space policy documents than any other administration. So maybe we won the numbers war, at least. We issued, the President signed 15 National Security Decision Directives, what we call NSDDs. These were policy statements, decisions on his part dealing with space during his administration. I was there for all but 5 of those. I think all of those policy documents reflected the President's optimism and commitment to demonstrate U.S. leadership and our exceptionalism on multiple fronts. The U.S. space program fit perfectly in his vision of the future for our country. The tools for executing that vision were provided by an economy that was called the largest peacetime boom in the history of the United States. Over 35 million jobs were created from the beginning of his administration to the end. In his State of the Union address early during his administration, the President stated that developing the frontier of space would be one of the 4 major priorities for his administration in the 1980s. That's pretty heady stuff. I think this is the first time a president had ever spoken that highly of space. And in fact, the Senior Interagency Group for Space was only one of 4 senior interagency groups established by the President. The other 3 were on foreign policy, defense, and intelligence. To me, again, that emphasizes the importance he placed on space. Early on the administration, our attention was focused on the shuttle program, obviously because previous policy statements had announced that the shuttle would be the primary launch system for both the military and the civil sectors of space. Immediately after I got into the White House, I became aware of the military's attitude toward that policy, which wasn't very friendly. The military had fought that policy before it had been announced. They felt that they were doing perfectly fine with unmanned expendable launch vehicles for getting their satellites into orbit, and forcing them on board the shuttle was not something they looked upon favorably. So they weren't real happy with it. And the main thing that they weren't happy with was placing primary reliance for the military's access to space on one vehicle, the shuttle. So one of the first things that we did was to arbitrate an agreement between NASA and the Department of Defense, between Pete Aldridge and Jim Beggs, that permitted the Department of Defense to crank up the production lines for heavy lift launch vehicles that eventually resulted in the Titan IV, and also agreed that in the context of NASA that the Department of Defense would continue to use the shuttle for at least a third of its launches. This seemed to make both relatively happy. Also, during our administration, we expanded the fleet from the 4 orbiters approved by the Carter administration to 5. We permitted the use of the shuttle for foreign and commercial launches, something that hadn't been done before. We encouraged technical assistance and launch assistance to friendly foreign governments. And these were just a few of the policy statements relating to the shuttle. There were many more. Perhaps one of the major achievements of our administration, I think, was to elevate the commercial space program. The President had a great deal of faith and trust in the private sector, and he wanted to stimulate entrepreneurship, to get private enterprise going in space, and he felt to do that he had to break down a few barriers. So the first thing he did was issue a statement that promoted private investment in space and the U.S.'s contribution to facilitate that. We worked to establish a pricing mechanism for commercial and foreign launches on the shuttle that we needed to balance, on the one hand, foreign competition. The French were heavily subsidizing the Ariane launch vehicle, so We wanted to make sure that the shuttle was competitive against those foreign launchers. That on the one hand. On the other hand, the commercial in order to stimulate a commercial ELV, expendable launch vehicle industry in the United States, we could not have the shuttle price so low that it would not incentivize the investors to invest in those commercial ELVs. So we had to strike a suitable balance, and that took many meetings to do. One of the more important things that we did was to permit the use of government ranges and launch facilities for private launches. This resulted in the private industry not having to make the large capital investment and expenditures in ranges and launch facilities associated with the development of new ELVs. Clearly, the centerpiece of President Reagan's space policy as it regards the military sector was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as the media coined it, Star Wars. You gotta love the media. The President had announced this policy on March the 23rd, 1983, in a televised speech to the nation that was supposed to be primarily devoted to the defense budget. And he tagged on at the very end this little thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which, as he described it, signaled a major shift away from a policy of our government that relied on mutual assured destruction, or as it was appropriately coined, MAD, as the primary philosophy for defending our nation. A philosophy that said that the Soviet Union won't attack the United States because we'll have a triad of nuclear offensive systems that could retaliate, and vice versa. The President said, this is hogwash. The United States should be able to defend itself. If we have the technology to do that, there should be nothing to stand in the way of the United States developing and implementing a system that defends us against a nuclear attack. And that signaled the beginning of the SDI program that really signaled the shift in space policy as it regards the military sector. Traditionally, the Department of Defense has relied on space systems as what might be called force enhancers, that is, systems that support the operating forces with communications and navigation and other things. This policy in effect said that the medium of space can be used to defend our country, what some might call a warfighting capability. Although the emphasis was always on non-nuclear capability, since the placement of nuclear weapons in space are prohibited by international treaty. Some of the original intention of the SDI program did not materialize because the technology didn't materialize. I mean, most obviously, SDI today is a ground-based defensive system. Many of the technologies that were intended to be developed, such as space-based lasers and various kinetic energy devices, didn't really materialize or prove to be the most cost-effective way of defending our country. But we still rely on space systems, of course, to support SDI as well as other capabilities. In August of 1984, the President issued a national space strategy which reaffirmed the Department of Defense reliance on space systems as an integral element of its warfighting capability. And one of the things which I don't know that I've ever heard mentioned, the National Space Strategy directed the Department of Defense to look at options for elevating the organizational options for elevating the importance of space in the military. This resulted in the formation of the U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs. The implementing actions associated with the private sector, commercialization of the private sector, were also mentioned in the space strategy. And it also, of course, documented his decision earlier on the space station, which I'll mention in a moment. And it announced the formation of a national commission on space and defined the goals that he wanted that commission to pursue. The centerpiece of the President's civil space policy was his approval of the International Space Station program. At the request of the NASA administrator, Jim Beggs at the time, I arranged a meeting with the President in April of '83. Jim Beggs briefed the President. They talked to the space station being the next logical step beyond the shuttle for the manned space program. He also emphasized the rapid development of the Soviet Soyuz space station. If you wanted to get President Reagan's attention, you talked about the Soviet threat, and there was a Soviet threat to our leadership in the manned space program in the form of that space station. Following that study, the President developed or signed a study directive which asked the Senior Interagency Group for Space to conduct a study of the permanently manned space station. NASA conducted a dedicated study on the space station, headed up by a gentleman named John Hodge, and I was given the responsibility for taking that study, comparing it with other options, and presenting that to the President, which I did early in late in 1983. I briefed that to the President, and almost all those in the cabinet meeting on that day agreed that the space station was the logical next step for our country. The President's approval of the space station was announced in his State of the Union address in January of 1984. In 1988, the last year of the Reagan presidency, Congress passed a law allowing the creation of the National Space Council, a cabinet-level organization, which you'll hear more about in just a minute. This was a fitting in for the cowboy from California who used the space program as a symbol of U.S. leadership and a brighter future for America and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gil. So now we move on to the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, where the world changes again. The Soviet Union disintegrates. Managing that process in a peaceful manner certainly is one of the hallmarks of the first Bush administration. You have the first Gulf War that's fought, where we begin to see in clear terms on national television the integration of space capabilities to enhance American warfighting capabilities. Who can forget on CNN seeing the pictures of precision-guided munitions going in a window? That video is seared in the minds of those of us that followed that conflict, and it was a perfect illustration of how America had integrated its space-based capabilities into its terrestrial warfighting capabilities. And some say that reconnaissance strike complex, as the Soviets called it, that we had created and invested in throughout the end of the Cold War, operationalized then in the first Gulf War, has fundamentally changed the space policy discourse, in particular as it relates to military affairs since then. This Bush administration creates the National Space Council. The first two speakers talk about in various respects how you organize for space activities, but it was the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that decides this needs to be a cabinet-level set of decision-making. And so at the White House, you have a National Space Council chaired by the Vice President. And you also have the authorship of a Space Exploration Initiative, SEI as it was called, which attempted to define a new course for American space exploration in a post-Cold War context where we're not competing with the Soviets for leadership in space. What's our path forward in the absence of the Cold War? Central to most of these decisions was Mark Albrecht, who is the principal advisor on space to President Bush, serving as the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council during his administration. Dr. Albrecht.
Good morning, and thanks, Jeff, for that introduction. This is a pleasure, and I'm enjoying this as much as you are. It's interesting to hear the continuity, and I'm kind of want to read ahead to see where the hell we are. I guess in this chapter of the U.S. national space policy, I'd call this is where it gets interesting. You heard from Gil, President Reagan did a remarkable job in leading the nation in the space program at the end of the Cold War, and put in play a lot of things that needed to get elaborated on, definitized, and operationalized, and that really is what happened in the Bush administration. As has been said, in 1988, the Congress and the NASA authorization bill began to recognize that things were beginning to get complicated with regard to space and space policy, and in fact authorized the President to create a National Space Council inside his White House. Despite the fact that most White Houses, as everybody in this panel will agree, jealously guard executive privilege, when Congress tells them this is the way you're going to organize, this is who you're going to choose, they tend to bristle. But the Bush administration, President Bush personally, decided that he was okay with the idea of a National Space Council. In fact, there were some communications from the then Vice President's staff to the Hill that he would be accommodating to this. And so when he came into office in April of '89, he signed the executive order that established the National Space Council. There were a variety of things, and to kind of follow on from Gil, that shaped the space policy issues that the Bush administration faced right from the beginning. The first and foremost, while the ball was teed up, and certainly President Reagan and his administration was central in ending the Cold War, it didn't actually end until the Bush administration, and that had enormous consequences for our space program. As Gil said, President Reagan and that administration was very much animated by the Cold War and the race with the Soviet Union. And at the end of the Cold War, that source of animation, that source of motivation, was removed. We had a series of concerns right away with the end of the Cold War. One was, what are we going to do with Russian weapons, their inventories and capabilities? Where are they going to go? Who's in control? Who's in charge? How do we incentivize Soviet technologists not to sell their know-how or components to other nations around the world that in the vacuum of a post-Cold War world would have ambitions about creating their own regional power centers? And we also had a problem immediately thereafter, which was how to define U.S. national security space requirements and forces post-Cold War. Again, as Gil adequately described, so much of our national security space program, forces, policy, structure, strategy were based on the primary conflict associated with the Cold War. We now had to say what were the right set of requirements and forces to meet our objectives, and what were our objectives after the Cold War. We also had to deal with the immediate response of Congress and the American public for a peace dividend. There was an expectation with the end of the Cold War the dollars spent on our national security now could be saved and returned to the taxpayers and applied to other purposes. It's staggering now, but in this period of time, then Congressman Les Aspin was talking about a 25 to 30% immediate reduction in the DoD budget, and that's not a leveling off. That was a real reduction in the budget. So if you had $100 billion last year, he was talking about $60 billion. That was going to put an enormous squeeze on the procurement and R&D accounts, because you have to pay personnel first. Even though if you have a rapid drawdown of forces, it'll take a while to get men and women out of the services. It'll take a while to stop necessary O&M. And so while you take a 30% reduction at top line, the procurement and R&D accounts, which are dollars, not people and pay, etc., are accelerated. So that was sometimes looking at 50, 60% reduction. That was a significant challenge. We were worried about the technology pipeline closing. Gil talked about SDI. One of the benefits of SDI was that it had another Cold War injection of technology acceleration in the United States. I mean, that story is yet to be written, but it is remarkable the amount of technology that came out of SDI efforts in optics, etc. It was a whole field of physics that in 1985, talked to friends and colleagues who were physicists, optics was not considered a very, very important part of physics. Everybody was into nuclear particle physics, etc. But the SDI program re-energized the whole optical part of the physics business, and the enormous outflow of technologies that have accelerated everything in today's world. We also had a recession. Did I mention that? And a recession was looming, and we had a president that had made a pledge not to increase taxes and do all with spending cuts. That was a huge problem, and so space was going to take a huge hit, or potentially huge hit, out of this. We also had a space launch crisis. Right at the interregnum, right between Reagan and Bush, we had the Challenger accident. And that took an already fragile, as Gil adequately described, launch picture for the United States and really put us into a crisis mode. The shuttle did not return to flight, was stood down for 32 months. And so here we had a national launch policy and national launch strategy based on a single thread to space, which was the space shuttle. And with the Challenger accident, 32 months, we had no access to space. As Gil said, and I was up at the Hill working for Senator Pete Wilson of California at the time, Pete Aldrich deserves great gold stars for American space history because he almost single-handedly, I don't know what was going on inside the administration, but up at the Senate Armed Services Committee over much objection, was able to get what he called the complementary expendable launch vehicle program funded. If we hadn't had that, the United States would have literally been grounded for almost 3 years. We also had a situation at NASA with the space shuttle crisis and Space Station Freedom that was really beginning to stop, moving from view graphs to actually building something. We began to understand the program. The shuttle program was in disarray at NASA in 1988. Space Station Freedom, which Gil neglected to admit that Administrator Beggs had told President Reagan was going to cost $8 billion. By 1989, the first time we kind of opened the envelope, it was 400% cost increase, and it was rapidly escalating. Fundamentally, when you began to get beyond the view graphs, you understood that the number of shuttle flights every year required to assemble the space station was 2 or 3 times the annual flight rate that had ever been exhibited by the shuttle. The requirement for extravehicular activity, which was the design choice, which was to take up big pieces and assemble them in space, was more in any year, in 1 year of space station construction, was going to be more EELV hours than had been witnessed or by all spacefaring nations together. It exceeded it in 1 year. So there was really serious questions about the feasibility of Space Station Freedom as designed. The National Academy of Sciences began to question the scientific use of the space station. In fact, they were very explicit and critical that the science that they saw coming out of the space station, particularly when some of the first trade-off decisions were made, a large centrifuge that was going to allow the creation of all kinds of life science experiments, they called it marginal. We had the beginning of unhappy international partners who had gleefully signed up to be part of the Space Station Freedom program, but as that program began to evolve and the interactions and the decisions, they realized there were less partners than subcontractors, and there was real unhappiness being expressed about that. And the planetary program and the Great Observatory programs had been put on hold with the 32-month hiatus. So NASA was in a situation of defocused, shaken, unstable program. But that's not all. there was at this time the beginnings of a very serious concern about global climate change. And there was a very strong initiative on the part of the Hill and from outside academic community that in fact the United States should have a heavy emphasis on global change, global climate change. And the way it was coming to us was that the problem was so critical and the tangible and crucial to the future of the world that we needed to act first and study as we were allowed to. And so we were faced with a global climate change steamroller that was coming down the hill that expected the space program to not start studying it, but in fact implementing large programs in low Earth orbit to begin providing data to actually start acting on global climate change. The EOS, the Earth Observing Satellite System, which was right at the end of the Reagan administration, was started at NASA, was designing 2 gigantic platforms, both in excess of $1 billion, going to take 10 or 12 years to develop. Again, it was a result of the enthusiasm in the science community, and it was also the NASA culture. Was when there was money to be had and there was a big exciting new project, they embraced it heartily. As Gil said, we also had an emerging commercial space market. It's something that's been on the horizon with the Carter administration. It was embraced in the Reagan administration, trying to create the fertile ground for it to grow. By the time we arrived, there was $5 billion a year of actual commercial space business, and it was beginning to get complicated. Rules of the road, what the proper role of the government, how to interact with other countries, what we expected at it, what the role of government utilization of commercial services. So that was clearly a large contributing. So all of those things were the kind of, now it gets complicated vision of where we found space policy and space needs. As we said before, we had a National Space Council. The President was interested in the area of it, and so he was more than happy to have one. We had great relations, and as each one of these guys will tell you, the chemistry inside the White House makes a big difference on what can be done and how it's done. If there's internal wrangling for a variety of reasons, things get hard. If there's comedy, if there's clarity, and there's unity, then a lot of good things can happen. We had clarity, comedy, and unity in the Bush White House. Brent Scowcroft is a terrific guy at the NSC. He clearly deferred to us on space matters. Obviously, there are national security and intelligence space matters that required the NSC to be a joint partner in all these things. He had low ego, enormous energy, and there were a lot of issues that he was focused on elsewhere with the end of the Cold War. OSTP, Science and Technology Policy, that's where Art resided. In our case, we had Alan Bromley, a terrific guy. He was very, very focused on the superconducting super collider project down in Texas. It really was the main focus of OSTP. We also had a variety of things on biometrics that really focused Alan, and Alan was more than willing to let the Space Council take the lead. Dollars matter. Dick Darman was our director of OMB, and he was a bona fide space guy. He loved space, very energetic, extremely brilliant guy, and as long as we stayed within certain boundaries, Dick Darman was an actual ally. He did some really remarkable things when he was OMB. John Sununu, for crying out loud, was a scientist, and he, as he reminded us on occasion, went to graduate school on a NASA scholarship. And so he certainly was enthusiastic. And it turned out to be the one of 2 most primary policy assignments of the Vice President. So we had all the ingredients there to make the Space Council active and engaged on all of the topics. And so it worked very well. We ran it just like the NSC. We had regular meetings. We had meetings with the principals, deputies. We had a variety of committees formed, etc., to go deal with that confluence of issues that I described in the very beginning. Our primary policy focus, the first direction of the President was keep U.S. out in front in space. As the Cold War rolled down, that U.S. space leadership was not just a consequence of Cold War, not just a reaction to Soviet space program, but in fact U.S. space leadership had salience and importance for the country going forward, and that we were to tailor and design the policies of the administration to ensure U.S. space leadership given the changing circumstances. Probably the most significant thing we focused on was the Space Exploration Initiative, and it's very complicated. But the basic tenets were that all the problems that we saw, all the problems from U.S. domestic economic to technology pipeline, etc., were at risk in the President's mind with the end of the Cold War. That, in fact, with the rapid reduction of expenditures in defense, the heavy deleveraging on R&D and procurement would really put the United States at a technology disadvantage. So one of the primary motivations, first, that space and space leadership is important for America, even outside the context of the Cold War. Second, that the technology driver, the historic technology driver that space and national security space had played in the previous 30 years really needed to be sustained, and in fact a bold new initiative in space exploration would be a way to continue that flywheel of technology going in the future. International leadership post-Cold War, again, it's now a truism, but at the time the sheet was blank about what world leadership meant, what the new world order was going to be. As President Bush wrote in his book with Brent Scowcroft, A World Transformed, it literally was transformative during this period of time. And the Space Exploration Initiative was a vision of how the United States could show leadership, could in fact provide positive global leadership in an area that talked about technology and economic benefits to all nations. And most importantly, the vision from the very beginning including Russia and the Soviet Union, now Russia, in the mix. And in fact, not just as a adjunct, as a lot of participants in the space station program had been, but as a real partner. It turned out that that leverage really was used with great success in the Clinton administration, where those initiatives and that vision were really put to great use for different purposes, and I'll let Richard tell you about that. We wanted to refocus the entire civil space program. The shuttle station confluence, as I said, was very complicated. And when you began to look at the real structure of the program, and you added in what the National Academy was telling us about the value of the science, you begin to see that this is, we didn't call it that, but it has been termed a dead-end program, stuck in low Earth orbit doing science that was not being endorsed by the National Academy of Science. And as budget pressures continued, and the program got necessarily de-scoped as we felt it would over time, things like the centrifuge being reduced first and then finally eliminated, that in fact we needed to reorient the entire civil space program. We also, many of us were believers, some took some heat for it, but we believed that some of the concepts associated with the Strategic Defense Initiative were applicable to what was then an aging civil space program. We called it faster, cheaper, better. I think Richard and the Clinton administration morphed it into a different way, and that's great. But we believed that there were ways to do things in space that really could give us better technology, faster, and in fact, in doing it better and faster, it would be done more cheaply. We also wanted the industry, the defense and the aerospace industry, to pivot after the Cold War from its focus on supplying critical national security needs to an ambitious civil space program. We then, as another policy initiative, took a new launch capability. The shuttle, as I said, had gone through a lot of fits and starts. It was a very expensive program, magnificent technology, an extraordinary capability, but it was fragile and it was expensive. And with the incident of the Challenger, even though they flew 8 times after it returned to flight in '88, in September of '88, it flew 8 times in the next year. But within 18 months, we were stood down again for month after month after month with hydrogen leaks, etc. It's just a very complex system. We had the CELV program, the Titan IV, as Gil described. Very expensive, very delicate, 18 months on the pad. We needed a new launch system. We needed it for national security purposes. We wanted it for civil space purposes. We wanted it flexible, robust. We wanted it very affordable, adaptable to a lot of means, and we spent a lot of time and energy on that program and a lot of money. We looked at a national aerospace plan, again, something that President Reagan admired, with the idea of going from Los Angeles to Tokyo in 3 hours and then ultimately be able to sustain orbital flight in a vehicle that would be a single stage to orbit, which, as you all know, is more or less the holy grail of the space launch business. We made an important policy decision. The President made a very important policy decision with regard to the shuttle. When we came in 1988, there was a request for an additional orbiter by NASA. And after we went through this entire plan of putting together an overall program, decided that additional shuttles were not going to be the way we wanted to go. It was very difficult, and I think, as we'll see with some of the speakers that will go down the chain, if you keep the baseline program intact and then try to do something new, I'll cut to the end of the story. You can't do both. And it is very hard to stop. Believe me, it is very hard to stop. And everyone here has had this experience, and I'm eager to hear from our colleagues further on down the chain. It's very hard to stop once you start. We stopped the Space Shuttle program, and our view was that it would stop flying in 2005. That was actually in a policy directive, and it turns out it looks like it's going to be 2011. That's pretty good, I mean, as I say, for government work. Okay, let's see. New launch. Okay. Again, as Gil said and Art said, commercial space was growing. It was $5 billion a year when we were there. There were a lot of policy decisions made that were clearly on the side of encouraging commercial space, but there were a lot of detail implementing policies that needed to be rolled out, and we spent a lot of time on that. It was a serious policy focus. Just defining what the role of government, what the responsibilities of government were, dealing with the issue of subsidized development and operations as opposed to non-subsidized. Again, it's in the kind of grinded out phase of government. It's the real spade work was done by Presidents Reagan and Carter, recognizing that this is going to be an important part of the American space future, but it really was left to the Bush administration to start providing the real details and rules of the road of it. So that was a large policy initiative of our administration. We restructured the climate change program. We were able to use independent commissions, et cetera, to say, hey, study first, then take action. So we didn't need to do everything at once at climate change. Big problem, important problem, urgent problem. But in fact, it was better to build multiple small platforms to start collecting data on climate change rather than to wait for 10 years for multi-million-dollar programs that was going to collect data on everything and start providing it. You guys remember the EOS DISC program, some of the original ideas of the amount of data that was designed to come down to the Earth daily was staggering, although it's probably in your handheld today. Finally, I'd like to say that Desert Storm really helped solidify national space policy, national security space policy. We had a space policy, national security space program that was primarily designed to prosecute a potential war with the Soviet Union. And we all know with the Fulda Gaps and all those activities and nuclear attacks, etc. Desert Storm really began to show how all of those space systems that had been designed could be used in conflicts far short of a major conflict with the Soviet Union that could involve nuclear weapons. And in fact, that established the beginnings of a policy about what should be our national space policy with regard to national security. We needed that they were absolutely critical to military operations, whether they were small or large. That was new. That they were necessary, that they needed to be sustained, modernized, and they had to be protected. So all of a sudden, we crossed over the line. You know, Art talked about a missed opportunity, and we had one, where we could have signed up for an arms control agreement with that. I think by the time Desert Storm occurred, it became clear that arms control is going to be very, very difficult if the United States national security apparatus was to be as reliant on space assets as it was clearly demonstrated to be in Desert Storm. It was an eye-opener. Chuck Horner, who was the Allied commander of air forces in Desert Storm, called Desert Storm the first space war. Between navigation, real-time reconnaissance, communications, it became very clear that U.S. military forces in the future would operate on a backbone of space-provided capability. Not Cold War space-provided capability, but new space capability involved in doing military operations around the world 24/7 in regions that could not be predetermined and prepositioned for. This was really new and important, and we spent a lot of time on that. They asked about what were some of the impediments. We had a lot to do. We focused on a lot of different policy areas. I think a lot of them, as you can see, there is a lineage to all this. We did have impediments, and I think it's really important to get them out on the table because it's part of the space policy and space program history. And it's best summarized, in my opinion, by a chapter or a paragraph in the final report we provided the President in January of 1993 that said, and here is talking about the space launch, what we wanted to do with space launch, but it really applies to a lot of things across the board. During the intervening 5 years, efforts to secure support for a new launch system have been largely unsuccessful. The failure of our institutions, U.S. government agencies, Congress, and the aerospace companies to converge and agree to support and fund a new launch system not only is short-sighted, but will prevent us from achieving many, if not most, of our long-term space objectives. That's something that's worthy of discussion because that's a recurring theme. Missed opportunity. We do have a missed opportunity. I have this personal one. When we came in, Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin, had put in the appropriations bill a requirement that the President certify within 30 days of being sworn in his intentions on space station freedom. Senator Proxmire was not a fan of space station freedom. It turns out that the time is so fast, and I think all of our colleagues will attest to this, the time is so fast. You're playing double time, triple time when you're in the White House. It seems to be a blur. It moves at the speed of light. A 30-day injunction after swearing in. I was sworn in on March 1st of 1989. And we were already 10 days into the period of time. We didn't even have an office. Long story short, we ended up working quickly and getting the President letter over to the Congress certifying space station freedom. It was an opportunity missed. If we had really done a real zero-based review, you know, it's arguable whether at that time in that place the system would have stood still for that. It's debatable. But it's a regret I have, and I've talked to both the President and Vice President about it, and I think that given the way things rolled out eventually on the space station, had we done a thorough zero-based review at that time, we might have made things a little bit differently. So that's a small, I think, missed opportunity. So what were the significant achievements of the Bush administration, in my opinion? First and foremost, we defined a post-Cold War national security space framework that's sustained today. I think that you could take a direct line from that because before was Cold War national security, space policy and strategy and forces, and afterwards was a post-Cold War world. Space is vital to military operations. It must be protected, cannot be threatened. Critical. We created a policy for commercial space commerce that's sustained today, that government supports, utilizes, facilitates, encourages, and protects U.S. commercial space enterprise. We initiated cooperation with the Russians. It was modest by the end of the Bush administration. We had agreed for the Shuttle Mir program, which had been in the works for about 3 years, but Desert Storm intervened, and eventually, before the President left, we signed with Boris Yeltsin an agreement to fly cosmonauts on the shuttle and put U.S. astronauts on Space Station Mir, and that really opened up the opportunities for a lot of cooperation, very positive on the U.S. side. I want to talk just briefly about, because I'm going to be a little controversial here, 2 points. One, I think a largely unintended, but perhaps the most significant policy initiative by the Bush administration, unintended, but potentially most significant, was when we convened the Advisory Commission on the Future of the United States Space Program, the so-called Augustine Commission 1. Variety of reasons. Long story. If you want that story, by the way, I have a book coming out in another 3 weeks called Falling Back to Earth, a first-hand account of the great space race and the end of the Cold War. You can read in detail about that. But the Augustine Commission, even though it was designed to focus on the specific issue of NASA organization, the Space Exploration Initiative, freedom, Space Station freedom, and the shuttle, had the unintended but significant consequence, in my mind, of creating the intellectual and programmatic framework for NASA post-Cold War that was based primarily on our wallet, not our will. And it was focused on balancing and satisfying competing space stakeholders rather than subordinating them to national objectives. That's worthy of additional discussion. Finally, in conclusion, I will say another, I think, controversial thing. And that is, in my opinion, having looked at this, and this would be a fun thing for the panel to discuss, I believe that the United States human spaceflight program died at the end of the Cold War. And it was like a radiation sickness, not an execution. The lethal dose was administered at the end of the Cold War, and for a variety of reasons, we have seemed to be, and I believe we are incapable now of really re-energizing a human spaceflight program. I think it's a tragedy. I think it's something that needs to be rethought. But I think at this, as we look down the list here, I look at our chair during the Bush administration, the end of the Cold War, as the period of time when the human spaceflight program in the United States essentially was terminated. So with that, I look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Next, we have the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was marked by the emergence of globalization, the real emergence of terrorism. We have the bombing of the USS Cole, cruise missile strikes into Afghanistan. We had the Somalia situation, the Bosnian War. We also have the rise of China. And in our industry, we do have the rise of satellite services to the consumer. I know during the Clinton administration, and I think we have somebody from Hughes Network Systems here, I bought my first satellite dish for DirecTV services, and I think several thousand others across the United States, and by the end of that decade into the millions, did the same. To represent the Clinton administration, we have two gentlemen. Richard DalBello. Richard, under the Clinton administration, was the Assistant Director for Aeronautics and Space in the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. We also have Steve Moran. Steve was a Senior Policy Advisor for Space and Aviation in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. One small caveat. I know Steve has a deadline in terms of time. He has to take a critical phone call at a specific time. Depending on how Rich goes, we'll either have Rich solo or Rich and Steve. So let me hand it over to Rich.
Depending on how I go. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and to echo what Mark said, to listen to this fascinating story as it unspools across across time. I think clearly one of the themes we're hearing, which I'm sure will continue with the other speakers, is that although the administrations change in focus, sometimes significantly, we have some very stable themes that are running through this story, and there's themes that started in the Kennedy administration that continue on now into the Obama administration. And I think the organizers, and thank you very much to the Space Enterprise Council and the Marshall Institute for conceptualizing this very interesting event. But one of the things the organizers asked us to do was spend a little time talking about context, and I think each of the speakers before has done a wonderful job of reminding us what it was like to live and make decisions in those times. And I think at the end, Mark was trying to be controversial, but I think he is putting his finger on an important fact that where we are today in society and our economy and our place in the world, some things that were possible during the Kennedy or the Reagan administrations are probably not going to happen again. There are significant changes that have changed the context where we are. So what we want as a nation out of our space program and who we expect to do those things are going to be fundamentally altered as we go forward in the future. The Clinton administration, again, each administration, as we've already seen, you don't invent the world new. The world is as it is when you take over. You may have won the office with an orientation. Ronald Reagan certainly with an orientation of strong leadership. And a goal to express a unique American voice in the world. The Clinton administration, not quite so dramatic. If looking around the room, I guess about half of you were around and thinking about administrations when this happened, and the other half of you were probably not. But if you recall, the big phrase in the Clinton election was, "It's the economy, stupid." It was a goal to refocus America on America, and now an interest to remember in the context of where we are with the budget today, a really hard focus on the budget realities. We had a young, I think with all due respect, slightly disorganized president, tremendously creative, a Congress first Democratic and then a Republican Congress after some significant, I think, missteps on the part of the administration, and a re-energized focus. And this was the period in which we shut the government down. So there was a lot of looking inward at this time. The themes that Mark talked about are still fundamental when the Clinton administration comes in. You had a winding down of the Cold War. You had a very serious concern with what was going to happen to all the very, very talented Soviet scientists and engineers. There was a lot of concern, as has already been mentioned, about the concept of terrorism and the fear over the issue of loose nukes. So a great deal of the energy, and I'll talk about the organization in a minute, but a great deal of the energy in thinking about space in the White House and the Clinton administration was in the office of the Vice President. And he had, and Vice President Gore had a very strong concern about what we could positively do to affect change within Russia. This wasn't certainly limited to the White House. The United States Congress was also deeply engaged in this issue. But certainly one of the things that happened was, because of the world situation, there was a renewed focus on trying to engage the Russians. Again, as Mark said, a dialogue which had already been begun in the Bush administration was then broadly expanded, trying to bring the Russians more fully into the space station. It was not without its bumps and bruises, for sure, as these two cultures collided in a very, very significant way. You had the U.S., which liked to do things its way, and the Russians, who, although at the time were in the middle of a significant financial and political crisis, were, of course, a very proud people and are very proud of their tradition in space exploration. And so those two cultures colliding in unlikely places like Houston was always an exciting thing to watch. I think another big theme which we've seen, and Gil described, I think, very well, the atmosphere and the goal of the Reagan administration in rolling out these really big themes, the Star Wars initiative, the National Aerospace Plane, and then through the Bush administration, the Space Exploration Initiative. And I think in all honesty, what you saw in the Clinton administration was a realization, and again, renewed focus on the economy, the budget, the realization of what these, certainly there are always ideologues and people who come to a position with an already prefixed mindset about it. But I think also there was a realization at the technical level just how massive these programs were. We'd spent a lot of money on these issues, and we hadn't made very much progress. Turns out the National Aerospace Plane, which is a great idea, and perhaps someday will be implemented, we just simply didn't have the technologies to do it. Same with, we've done a substantial amount of spending on the Strategic Defense Initiative since it was first announced by President Reagan, and we still see the complexity of that. There are always people who argue, well, if you'd spend more, you would have made greater progress. But these are monumental issues. And the issue isn't, can you make progress? The issue is, what is the percentage of the country's wealth that you want to spend on any given thing? And again, coming back to this issue of a renewed focus on the budget during the Clinton administration, if you will recall, we drove the budget, and it wasn't just the Clinton administration, it was with the assistance of a Republican Congress. We drove from a significant budget deficit to an actual surplus when the Clinton administration left office. There, at the same time, another key theme was reinventing government. Rightly or wrongly, there was, and it's interesting now to, in light of the Tea Party and the other things, to think about these roles. So if you think about it, Ronald Reagan was pushing large government programs. The Clinton administration was talking about reducing the size of government. So we have all these strange role reversals that happen as we go through time. Cheaper, faster, better, one of the themes that was, I think, planted in the Bush administration, was, again, played out more fully in the Clinton administration. There was a sense that we had tied ourselves up in endless bureaucracy and endless objectives, and there ought to be a way to move through technology in a more crisp fashion. And again, I think a key environmental aspect of the Clinton administration was to understand that this was the birth of the internet. I remember physically seeing the engineers come in and hook up the first T1 line to the White House. So prior to that, we were communicating over regular telephone wires. So we all got internet on our desks at the White House. So and to think at the same time of the tremendous explosion, the dot-com revolution that was happening, and there was a great sense of the vitality of the American entrepreneur. There was a company being born every minute. So some of those have now all have gone away, but some of the large icons remain. So I think that there was a sense of vitality and youth, and I think a little bit, I have to be honest here, I think the sense was that space was not as exciting as all of this, that space was too slow, too bureaucratic, too expensive, that there was some second and third guessing about the ultimate value of investment in space. During this time, the United States Congress had a moment of doubt, too, about the space station. There was a critical vote in the House, and the space station only passed by one vote. So there was a real thinking at this time that the space station might simply have gone away. But that vote did re-energize the whole purpose, and then the Vice President's office got involved and sort of reoriented the thinking about the space station as a fully international space station with the Russians in a way, which has actually paid off very handsomely, particularly now as we, first of all, the Russians have made a significant contribution over the years, but important now as we wind down the space shuttle program, the Russians will for a while be the only access we have to the space station. There were a couple of other, let me just talk about wins and losses if I could, and then if we can, is Steve, did he run? He'll be back. Okay. Let me just talk a little bit about, let me talk about organization first and then wins and losses. And I think if you heard We started out with space in the Carter and OSTP, then Gil talked about the SIG process, and then the SIG process grew in a way in conjunction with Congress to the National Space Council. When the Clinton administration came in, there was a real sense, again, going back to the reinventing government, that the White House had grown too large, that there were too many White House and White House-related advisory groups, and there was, whether it was wise or unwise, and we could have that discussion, there was a goal to cut the White House by 25%. As part of that initiative, they decided to take a step back from the Space Council and said, well, this is just like any other complicated issue. We don't have councils for the oceans. We don't have councils for the air. We don't really need a space council. And so what happened was the responsibility for space went back to OSTP. At that point, OSTP was run by Dr. Gibbons, who was a scientist and a physicist. And I think his passion for this was perhaps less real than his passion for science. And so I think that reflected, some of the decision-making reflected Dr. Gibbons' leadership on this. Of course, we always had the full involvement of Vice President Gore in all of these issues. But in terms of organization, the sort of day-to-day came back to OSTP, which meant something very critical. As Mark pointed out, at this time in history, there was also an extremely important national security space program. And what this meant was that you really did bifurcate these worlds in a way again. So you had, I was one of the team, and so was Steve. We were NASA guys, okay? So we were brought over to the White House, and our primary focus was civil space and NASA. So we didn't have the same focus that Gil and Mark did. We didn't have a sense that our portfolio was all of space. And I think ultimately that's not a good thing. I wouldn't ever argue that you ought to do a space council. Again, I think there are pluses and minuses. But I think that not having a coherent vision is important, and our primary focus was not on the National Security Space Program. And I think that if you come to this enterprise with that narrowed scope, you can't see the whole picture, because there's a tremendous amount that happens on that side. So I think that organization does ultimately matter. We made the decision, so really you had a triumvirate in the White House. The Office of Science and Technology Policy had the core responsibility, but there were many large decisions which were handled by the National Economic Council, and there were many, many large decisions, large dollar decisions that were handled by the National Security Council. So you sort of divided the responsibilities again. Wins and losses, and then I think I'll wind up. I think the biggest win, without question, was the Clinton administration's decision on the GPS program. Certainly we can't take credit for the GPS program itself, which had been the product of many presidents and much investment and some very wise decisions on the part of the Department of Defense to invest in this critical technology. But what the Clinton administration did is we had a fundamental decision to make, which is this something that we want to, you probably don't recall at the time they were actually dithering the signal, so to make it impossible to get an accurate signal out of the GPS system. They're actually actively involved in making the system bad for everyone except the military. And there were fundamental decisions were made, and essentially the question they were asking is, are we going to make GPS, are we going to pay for it and make it a global utility? Is the United States just going to give to the world this incredible tool, which every soccer mom and dad in America uses to find fields on Saturday and Sunday morning now, and we couldn't all of us have it now embedded in our mobile devices, so we couldn't find the Starbucks without it. But we made that decision, and it was not without controversy, and I think that was perhaps our best and most important decision. I think bringing the Russians into the space station, I think there's a lot to be said about whether the space station is a good idea or not, and history will write, and hopefully Mark's book will cover some of this. But bringing the Russians in, I think, was an unqualified good move. There was a lot of creative work that was done on air traffic. I think Steve's coming back, so I'll not talk about the air traffic modernization program. I think an important, it's complicated, but an important thing that the Clinton administration did was to privatize the entities Inmarsat and Intelsat. At the time, Inmarsat and Intelsat were basically intergovernmental organizations. They were owned by governments. And so the Clinton administration came in and said, well, this doesn't make sense. Why do we have governmental organizations providing a commercial service globally when companies can do this easily? It was very controversial at the time. Very, very little support from other countries when it was first announced, but I think it's paid off handsomely. And both companies have survived, have prospered, and continue to offer generations of new service and in ways that are fundamentally improved life around the planet. And I think there's a lot that could be said about the planetary science program. Again, this has been mentioned by several speakers. The question of getting the space station and the planetary science program to a place where it was fundable and sustainable over a long period of time was a challenge. And it was one where the White House and the Congress had to work cooperatively together. And I think, by and large, that's turned out well. There were some big losses, unfortunately, some big lessons learned. Perhaps the biggest loss was the MPOS program. We encouraged the consolidation of the military and civilian weather, polar orbiters weather system. It turned out to be a logistical nightmare with the primary user, with the triumvirate of NASA and NOAA and DoD trying to agree on a system. It grew phenomenally out of the budget. Just went haywire, and requirements for the system were uncontrolled in a way that the spending went dramatically out of control, and eventually the program had to be killed and separated. So that was a big loss. My own personal loss, I was very involved in space transportation policymaking at the time, and we were passionate about the X-33 program, the single stage to orbit, and I learned a very important lesson, which is policy never trumps physics. So you can say whatever you want, but if you can't do it, it won't happen. And we wanted to will single stage to orbit into existence. And we had a beautiful, Lockheed came up with a beautiful concept, and it looked like the future. And we just didn't have the technology. We did not have the technology. And ultimately, we did not have the will either. I think that I wouldn't say that national security space was a loss under under the administration. I think a lot of great programs were developed, but I can't really take credit for any of that. Is what I'm saying, is that there were a lot of good people working, and we weren't really deeply involved in that. So I think with that, I'll wrap it up. But again, I think this is a fascinating exercise, and I look forward to hearing the rest, how the story is going to end.
Thank you, Richard. So now we're at the second Bush administration, the administration of George W. Bush, where the world begins to change again. You have one of the interesting perspectives, I think, on the Bush administration at this time is the importance of expectations. Secretary Rumsfeld comes in and assumes control of the Defense Department, but he had just been chair of two other commissions in the latter portions of the Clinton administration. Those two commissions, one on missile defense and the other concerned with space management and organization, set expectations for how the community at large thought space policy and certain defense policies as related to missile defense were going to evolve. The Rumsfeld Missile Defense Commission outlines a very aggressive set of programs, including some elements of return to the Strategic Defense Initiative's use of space. The Rumsfeld Space Commission talks in great detail about the failings of the organizational process, but the importance also of space to our national security missions, and warns of a space Pearl Harbor. The expectation on the part of the community that was then observing the decisions of the Rumsfeld Defense Department and the Bush Defense Department and the Bush national security policy writ large, I think, then expects movement in the policy and movement in the budget along the lines predicted by these two commissions. But of course, reality changes. We have the terrorist attacks of September of 2001, the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which divert attention and resources onto immediate critical national priorities and perhaps shifts attention away from these policy movements that we thought would happen. You have the vision for space exploration that comes out in 2004, which again attempts to define a new path or in a new set of priorities for American space exploration. And you have a deteriorating economic condition in the second half of the two Bush administrations. All of these things then affect space decisions. Central, again, to these decisions were Bretton Alexander, who served as the advisor on space issues at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, bridging the Clinton administration into the George W. Bush administration. And while he was at the White House, Brett served as one of the principal authors for the vision for space exploration. Brett?
Thanks very much, Jeff. As he mentioned, I had the pleasure of being there at the end of the Clinton administration and through the transition, the election that lasted 35 days, and then the transition to the Bush administration. And that sort of period of turmoil, which we all thought would taper off into an administration that moved out in lockstep along these new lines of the way the Rumsfeld Commission had talked about national security, space, and other issues. Obviously, in the first year with 9/11, it didn't happen that way. Overcome by events is a good way to describe the reality on the ground in terms of the making of space policy and the use of space. So what you have throughout the rest of the administration, the next 7 years really, is a reality of the dramatic increase in the use of space for national security purposes, space being at the forefront of those issues and those activities, Afghanistan, Iraq, global war on terror, around the rest of the world as well. And at the same time, a space policy then that is trying to reflect that as opposed to trying to lead that. So when the National Space Policy comes out in 2006, it is although not dissimilar, in fact almost identical to previous policies, it is viewed not only by the administration, but it is viewed by the rest of the world as fundamentally different. It's viewed through a new lens. It is viewed as more bellicose, more unilateralist, things that the rest of the world sort of viewed as hallmarks of the Bush administration. So backing up before that, there was a reality, as I said, in the use of space for national security purposes. On the civil side, the reality on the ground was the Columbia accident. February 1st of 2003 changed everything from a civil space perspective. It changed with it came a recognition of the civil human spaceflight program as being fundamentally different than what we had thought, whereas I think the community thought it was more of an operational system that had people in space on the space station, permanent presence. It was working towards scientific goals, and I think in the light of Columbia, people said, what are we doing? We're not going anywhere. Why aren't we moving forward? Why are we flying something that we've been flying for 25 years? We need to change this paradigm. And I think an accident like that instantly changes the paradigm for folks watching it. One of the very first actions that the Bush administration took, and this was pre-9/11 with regard to the civil space program, was on everybody's favorite program, the space station program. So throughout the Clinton administration, when the program was finally solidified from a political perspective by bringing the Russians in, at the same time, every 2 years there was a budget overrun or cost growth of multiple billions of dollars. and it always had to be worked out. And my impression of those battles was that in the end, the schedule slipped, but NASA got the same program content for the station, some minor changes here and there. At the beginning of the Bush administration, there was a $4 billion, I believe it was, overrun on space station that was presented to the OMB within the first couple months. And the result of that was OMB and the White House pushed back and said, you don't get any more money. You don't get to keep the content. You have to cut content in order to meet your goals. That resulted in what was called U.S. Core Complete, which dramatically, I'd say, reduced the capability of the station, kept a lot of the scientific things that folks wanted off, habitation modules, things like that were no longer part of it. And then over the next year, U.S. Core Complete was sort of morphed into be International Core Complete because it had sounded like we weren't going to allow the international partners to bring up their modules, but of course that was always part of the plan, was to let them continue in that part of the program too. So it was a fundamental budget reality that the administration tried to instill in NASA programs. Along with that, outgoing Administrator Dan Golden, who had been there for 10 years, started under Bush 41, was there throughout the entire Clinton administration, was still there at the beginning of Bush 43, was replaced by Sean O'Keefe, who had been the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget for the first 9 to 12 months, I believe, of the Bush administration. And so it was a recognition to put in place a manager, a program manager, someone who could manage budgets, not a space person, not an astronaut, not someone who sort of was in and of the program itself. And I think that really said where the Bush administration was going. Mentioned the Columbia accident, and that really, fundamentally changed everything from the Bush administration's view of the civil space program. There had been an ongoing review of space policies, and there had been a remote sensing policy that had come out, or was about to come out. Space transportation policy was 99% done. I remember a meeting on the very last issue between NSC, OSTP, and NASA Administrator O'Keefe that happened on the Wednesday when Columbia was in orbit. And at the end of that meeting, we all thought we had come to agreement and the policy was done. And of course, that Saturday morning, everything changed, and we ended up putting off space transportation policy and redoing it 2 years later. So I had the pleasure of writing that policy twice and leading the interagency twice with 50 people around the room twice, for a year each time. And I bring that up because the administration, the Obama administration right now has just kicked off its space transportation policy review, and I'm just so glad it's them and not me. But I did enjoy, obviously, that process. There are two things about the Columbia accident and what came out of it that led towards the vision that I think are important. One is that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board came out in August, and we'd sort of known it leading up to that, but came out and said some very important things. In fact, there was a late ad to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board were folks to focus on policy instead of just the technical reasons of why the accident happened. That made a lot of us in the White House nervous, because now you're going to broaden it from here's what actually happened to here's why it happened, and start pointing fingers of blame. And what they ended up saying, and it was John Logsdon in particular, who was on the committee, who wrote Chapter 9, and what it said, that was of importance was that it was a failure of national policy. It was a failure of national leadership, that contributed significantly to the accident. That within the organization, there wasn't a sense of why we were doing it, where we were going, the importance of it, that had been lost. The second thing that they said was it wasn't a failure of this particular administration. It was a failure of national leadership over 30 years. It was a failure at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and of both political parties. And that was very interesting because I think at the highest levels of the Bush administration, what that said was, this one's not your fault. But if you don't change something now, there will be another accident, and that one will be your fault. You may be out of office, it may happen 10 years from now, but the finger will be pointed back at you and said, you were warned and you didn't do anything about it. And I think from the very beginning after Columbia, about 3 weeks after the accident, most of the pieces were being picked up, literally, down in Texas. We started a very small group of folks to say, okay, now what does this mean for the program? What does this mean for human spaceflight in general? And there were folks that said, you know, we shouldn't be doing this. We don't have a rationale to do it anymore. It's too much money. We don't have the money. And President Bush, on that day of Columbia's accident, had come back from Camp David, and he said, you know, something very important in his speech that he made. He said that, you know, we're going to keep doing this because it's important. He didn't say we're going to keep flying the shuttle. He didn't say any specifics like that, but he said we're going to keep doing this because this is important. It's part of the American character. And that was very useful because I carried his speech around for the next 2 months, and when people said we shouldn't be doing it, I'd pull it out and say, well, you don't get a vote. The President already said we're going to, so let's figure out what we're going to do, not if we're going to do it. And that was very powerful. At least it stiffened my spine a lot in a lot of those conversations. Consequently, I almost got fired a few times, but you gotta stick up for what you believe in when you get these opportunities. And I think everybody who's been up here today has, understands that when you get the opportunity to work at the White House, whoever you're working for, it's an opportunity that, number one, you can't pass up, but it really is something special. So as we were looking at what this meant for the space program, the human spaceflight program in particular, we kept having interactions with senior administration folks, Chief of Staff Andy Card, Deputy National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, National Security Advisor Condi Rice, others. And every time we brought them, sort of the latest rock of what we were thinking, they didn't say, oh, I like that, or I don't like that, or change this, change that. They just said, keep working. You go figure out what you think the right answer is, and bring that back. And I think that was very, very different than a lot of administrations would have acted, I think. In the end, when the decision meeting happened with the president and all of his senior advisors, the vice president, all the folks that people know in the Bush administration were there, Karl Rove and others. The decision was made not on the basis of wanting political credit, because, frankly, at that time in the administration, they'd just gone into Iraq. It was not going that well. Nobody was thinking, oh, this is going to be a Kennedy speech moment and everybody's going to love it. I think the president's father had done that and it had not gone so well. But it was a matter of, what's the right thing to do? How do we fix this? And therefore, all options were on the table. And I think ultimately, what I believe most about the vision was that it confirmed what certainly those of us in the space community had always said, which is that NASA is about exploring and going beyond, not about operating in low Earth orbit and doing things. But it once again put on the table that which had been taken off the table, which is that NASA should be going out and exploring. It also laid the groundwork for turning over the LEO activities to the private sector. It said in there, I think it was acquire commercial and international, services for crew and cargo to the international station. Later that summer of 2004, the Aldrich Commission that was put in place to look at implementation of the vision came out and said, turn LEO over to the private sector right away. And they said it much more elegantly than we did in the policy. And with the clarity of hindsight, I think we would have written things quite a bit different in order to make that happen. So with that, the vision became sort of the signature policy direction of the Bush administration. There were other policy documents. So there was a U.S. space exploration policy document that was issued with the vision, which was the vision. There were documents on space transportation, remote sensing. Remote sensing was really, had fundamental shift to allow foreign access to U.S. remote sensing capabilities and commercial capabilities to develop. Was done back in, I think, the either late Bush 41 years or early Clinton years was PDD NSC 23, which in the end had set up a tiered structure of how foreign companies could get access, and U.S. industry was going to develop these capabilities. And after 10 years or so, it had not developed the way we had thought it would, and therefore we redid that policy to have a partnership between the government and industry. And I think that has worked much better since then, because we now have commercial remote sensing companies that work both commercially and hand in hand with the government. But then we had this overarching national space policy. Now, I left 1 week after the second term began in January of 2005, and at that time we were about 95% done with the national space policy review. In fact, that was one of the reasons I felt, okay, I've been here 5 years, it's time to move on, and we're in a good place. All that's left is a couple dotting of I's and crossing of T's and a signature, and that document will be out. It was another 2 years before that document came out after I'd left. And the reason for that was there were one or two last remaining issues that were hotly debated, actually between the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. And so, when you get those titans, locking arms, or not locking arms, but butting heads, if you will, things take some time. And so when the policy finally did come out in the summer of 2006, it was surprising to me how it was viewed by the public, by the community, by the international community. While the tone had shifted a little bit in terms of national security priority versus scientific priority, the national space policy that Rich DalBello had done with the Clinton administration had said, Office of Science and Technology Policy leads space policy, NSC, co-leads it when appropriate. We all know what that means. The National Security Council is going to hold on to the national security space issues no matter what. But there's optics with that. The Bush administration policy sort of left those optics, aside and just said, here's how it is. The substance of the policy, particularly on peaceful uses of outer space, the willingness to enter into or not enter into arms control treaties about space, all of those things were no different substantively from the Clinton administration policy. There were a couple minor word changes. I remember going through the interagency policy meetings on that document led by Gil Klinger, who was at the National Security Council then. Unfortunately couldn't be here today. But going through those documents and saying, okay, if you change a single word, it will be noticed, and you must have a good reason why. And in the end, very, very few words were changed. And so when people came out, including Vice President Gore, former Vice President Gore, came out and said it was, a fundamental shift in policy and very unilateralist in its outcome, I was just surprised, because it really, to me, was a very marked a lot of continuity with the past, and there were not a lot of substantive changes. But looking ahead through the rest of the administration, the exploration activity, for example, the new administration that just came in, and I'm sure Jim will talk about this, found that to be, in their view, to be a broken program. So when we talk about wins and losses, missed opportunities, obviously the space exploration vision was near and dear to my heart. I think going back to the moon is going to happen before we go on to Mars with people, if we do. I don't dislike the idea of going to an asteroid first. I think you need fundamentally almost the same amount of infrastructure and cost if you're going to go to an asteroid versus the moon. But we're going to do all of these things if we can ever get out of low Earth orbit. The fundamental shift, which didn't happen in the second term of the Bush administration, that I think is happening now, is that shift to have commercial take over low Earth orbit so that NASA can get on with the business of exploration. So that, to me, is a missed opportunity in the past administration. So with that, I look forward to your questions, and I really have enjoyed what I've heard from the panelists today and the rest of the panelists as well. We'll enjoy. So thank you.
Thank you, Brett. I think that may be the current Obama space policy team calling in to make some comments on our program. That'll be taken care of in a second. And the Obama administration brings us full circle. During the Obama administration, we have the continuing war on terror, campaigns in Afghanistan, wrapping up activities in Iraq, and a new openness that the Obama administration has pushed forward, and that openness has been portrayed in the space policy that you'll hear about now. More of a focus on international cooperation and a look at a different blend of space players in our industrial base. Not only the companies that focus on the programs of record, but also the emergence of entrepreneurial and commercial space companies. To talk about the Obama policy, we have two gentlemen today. First, we have Jim Kohlenberger. Jim has a lengthy resume, but I will focus on his time focusing on space policy, and that was as Chief of Staff for the Obama White House. He was the Chief of Staff for the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Following Jim, we have Peter Marquez. Peter served under both the Bush and the Obama administrations working space policy, and at that time he was the Director of Space Policy at the White House. But first we're going to start with Jim.
Well, thank you, David, and it's great to be here and see so many folks. The great thing about making space policy as you move forward is your ability to stand on the shoulders of giants, and here we have some of the giants of space policy previous, and it's just wonderful to hear this, and I think you're going to hear this continuity of progress all throughout. And I was lucky as well to spend 8 years in the Clinton White House with the Vice President's office, where he had come out of the Senate Commerce Committee, where he chaired the Space Committee, and it was great because he was engaged in space policy and had a real passion. And the only thing that's better than having a vice president who is passionate about a vigorous space policy is having a president who is passionate about having a vigorous space policy, and that's what we had in the Obama White House. But to give you a little, context, and this is, of course, recent history, is, we came into office at a time when the benefits of space have completely permeated almost every aspect of our lives. From the iPhone on my belt to the navigation system that brought us here to the Google Earth that's on my laptop. Every day our life is now touched by space, and it's become even more vital to our economy, to our national security, to our environment. And yet we faced 4 immediate challenges in space when we first came into office. First we faced a Sputnik moment. And, it's fitting that the president used a space metaphor to describe where America was, in fact, at that moment. And we came in the midst of a recession. We were focused on, like a laser, on creating the jobs and new industries of the future. We knew that coming out of World War II, half of economic growth came from innovation. But at the same time, I think we were concerned that we had fallen behind in a few key indicators. So, for example, American 15-year-olds ranked 25th in math and 21st in science when compared to other nations around the world. And so we knew we needed to crank up the innovation engine. 2, we were faced with the imminent retirement of the space shuttle, which the Bush administration had set for a kind of a date certain at the end of 2010. GAO had highlighted for either, whoever won the election last time, that this would be one of the key 13 issues that any administration would need to take a look at, get under the hood, and figure out, because there wasn't a adequate strategy going forward. Third, the other issue we faced was that critical environmental, science, and technological innovation efforts had been really crowded out within NASA's budget by an ever-growing human spaceflight effort and other challenges. And it was, costing us in terms of some of the great opportunities, I think, that we saw in space. And on the national security side, after, 50 years of increasing use of space, space was getting more congested, contested, increasingly competitive. In fact, 60 nations now have a presence there. By 2015, there'll be 9,000 satellites with transponders. The skies overhead are so cluttered that, if you have major collisions, you can actually render orbits unusable. At the same time, we knew that, as others have described, we had big space programs that were, they have this tendency to have these huge cost grow way out in years, and we knew we needed a new acquisition strategy. We knew we needed to partner with the private sector in new ways, partner internationally, and we're also focused on bringing a new openness and transparency to what we did globally in space. And in everything that we did, the president really challenged us for a bigger vision, bolder action, for a brighter future, and he picked up this phrase, we needed to win the future, and that applied to what we were doing in space as well. And so, like our response to Sputnik, we often think about back in 1957, in those early space years, we had a space race. There were several components to that. Investments in space, but we also needed to invest in our human capacity and basic reach and basic research and technological development. In short, we needed to out-innovate, out-build, and out-educate the world. And so the president set a goal of boosting our efforts in R&D to 3% of GDP. For folks who don't remember, that was the amount of research we were doing at the height of the space race. And we haven't come back to that level yet. And so he set this broad goal, and he made historic investments in that area to back it up. And he laid out plans for us to move from the middle of the pack to the top of the world in terms of education. And I think people forget that at Apollo 11, in mission control, the average age was 26 years old, and yet today the average age in NASA is something around 50. And so we knew we needed to take a look at this new generations of space leaders and scientists to get involved. And unfortunately, today the average middle school kid would rather, take out the trash, go to the dentist before doing their math homework. or instead of doing their math homework. And we knew that we needed to do better. And so we launched a couple of initiatives early on. We brought together the space community and others in a Change the Equation, 100 CEOs to transform the way teachers teach and students learn, to create more makers, doers, and dreamers. The president hosted an astronomy night out on the south lawn of the White House to get kids focused on there. But our biggest challenge really was on the civilian side of space, in addition to kind of building the building blocks. So the Congressional Budget Office, the General Accounting Office had both highlighted a growing number of challenges with NASA's Constellation program, but I don't think we knew yet the breadth of the challenges or the scope of what our challenges would be facing up ahead. I think Brett alluded to some of the challenges. And so we took a page out of the Clinton administration and out of Bush 1. And in the Clinton administration, early on when they had the challenges, I think, with space station freedom and the cost growth that I think Mark referred to, the Clinton administration set up this VEST commission of outside experts to get under the hood and take a look at it. And we borrowed Norm Augustine, who I think Mark also referred to, and we put him back into service. And we brought together astronauts and engineers and space experts to really take a look at this program, get under the hood. They held meetings all across the country, sought input all over the place. And they came back to us, and in space terms, they kind of said, Houston, we have a problem. And we were actually really surprised at kind of the scope of what they found. They found that we were billions over budget, years behind schedule, unable to get us back to the moon on any reasonable time frame, and that the program had become fundamentally unexecutable. And so even though we were surprised, we knew we knew it was our job, we knew we could do better. And so with the results of the Augustine Committee, we embarked on a new effort to explore new worlds, create new jobs, develop more innovative technology, foster new industries, strengthen international partnerships, and increase our understanding of the universe. And their recommendations drew lessons from the decisions of many of these administrations that passed before. And so first and foremost was the shuttle. As Brett mentioned, the Bush administration made a decision to retire the shuttle at the end of 2010. That was a tough decision on their part. I think, as Mark points out, it's very difficult to fund a operational program, and you can't really fund a replacement program on top of it. It's a challenge. Sometimes they have to be done sequentially, and that was part of the challenge, I think, that led to the set of challenges that we faced when we came into office. But the Bush administration had made this decision to retire the shuttle. We said, okay, well, instead of just putting a time stamp on there, one of the things we saw in safety was if you drive shuttle launches just by an arbitrary timetable, you can run into safety problems. So we decided to add more money and fly it out in a safe and prudent way. We added a couple flights, but we're nearing the end of that incredible program soon. And on the $100 billion space station, again, we drew upon, I think, some of the lessons from previous administration. I think, Reagan had initially kicked off this effort, was when this thing started. Clinton administration, as I mentioned, pulled it out of the fire, saved it by one vote. The challenges we saw was that this program was going to have to be dumped into the ocean to be able to pay for a follow-on program. And we were concerned that after all of this investment, this time in putting it together, before we had actually turned it into a scientific lab, which was part of the original design, that we would have had to have deorbited. And so we decided to give it a new lease on life and another 10 years while also enhancing its utilization. And for beyond low Earth orbit, this is obviously always one of the holy grails in space, and to we set out to go places that men had never gone before on a more flexible path, which is what the Augustine Committee had talked about, while also matching, I think, importantly, means with mission. But Augustine found that one of the things that we had done was we had vastly underestimated over the decades in the new technologies that we needed to go beyond the Earth-Moon cradle. And we went back and we looked at one of the reports that the first Bush administration did, and we looked at all of the new technologies that they had outlined that we would need to go to Mars. And we actually found, holy cow, these are the exact same technologies that we need today. We hadn't actually invested in these new technologies to take us further, faster and farther into space. And someone during the process had developed this chart that showed that if we wanted to go to Mars, for example, it was going to take the lifting weight of 12 international space stations. And, you know, a combined weight was what it amounted to. And again, one international space station had required all of these space shuttle flights to get there. 12 times that was massive, but that with new technologies, you could dramatically reduce that weight that you would need equivalently to lift from 12 down to 2 international space stations. But that took things like in-orbit refueling and other new technologies that we hadn't yet really focused on or pushed for. So we sought to push the frontiers of innovation within the space program and develop these technologies before making a decision in terms of what type of heavy lift architecture we would pursue. And the President went down to the Kennedy Space Center to lay out some new goals for accomplishing new firsts in human spaceflight, including visiting an asteroid and eventually going to Mars. But with this looming gap in the time between the shuttle retired and between the new successor system, which the Augustine Committee had found wasn't even going to be ready to launch until 2017, 2 years after the space station would have had to have been dumped into the ocean. It really had nowhere to go. We knew that we needed to both extend the space station and find a way to accelerate that time that we could get access to low Earth orbit. So the Augustine Committee recommended a path for safely transporting U.S. astronauts on American-made spacecraft and ending the outsourcing of this work to foreign governments, and recommended a new commercial crew effort to harness American entrepreneurship and competitively fund the fastest possible development of a safe and affordable American-made vehicles, creating thousands of jobs and enabling full use of the space station. Now, really, this amounted to a new acquisition strategy, making payments based on milestones rather than cost-plus contracts, which is how things went before. Now, this commercial concept got a lot of attention in the press. Where did you come up with this idea? How did it come forward? And frankly, this genesis of this program is really was long in the making. You know, it began in the Carter administration when they first embraced commercial in the national space policy, and the Reagan administration when I think, you know, they created the FAA Office of Commercial Space and an EO on space in the first Bush administration when they signed the Launch Services Purchase Act. And in 1998, when President Clinton signed the Commercial Space Act and contracted out shuttle operations to private companies. And as Brett mentioned in 2004, I think the second Bush administration in the Aldrich Commission and elsewhere recommended using commercial enterprises for our access for both crew and cargo to low Earth orbit. And soon by 2008, actually Congress had weighed in and actually pushed NASA to develop a program for cargo and crew access to the International Space Station. And so we built on that history of harnessing our entrepreneurial energies to help serve so that NASA could focus on the hard things. So overall, our plan that we put together included more money for NASA, more jobs for the country, more competition in space, more investments in innovation. By extending the space station, it was 3,500 additional astronaut days in space over the next decade. We saw it as more rockets launching sooner, more destinations for a really ambitious space program, while allowing NASA to really focus on the hard things that it is best at. New technological developments and getting beyond low Earth orbit and the technologies that we need here. And although this was really seen as big change, there's a lot of continuity, I think, with what folks have put together before. And to be sure, there's been critics, as there have been at every major turning point in space policy. But within 6 months, we saw bipartisan legislation in the works to move much of the administration's plan into law. Congress passed it, the administration signed it, and it was really an important milestone and critical step in our space strategy for achieving the president's goals. And it really happened sooner than we ever thought possible. And it's really thanks to the leadership of Senators Nelson and Hutchison and others in the Senate for making that happen. And indeed, much work lies ahead, and the history is still being written, but there's really some exciting stuff that is happening today because of the work that these gentlemen have done and what NASA is doing today. And I think it's really exciting progress in space. And, in the coming months, NASA is poised to announce more details on the heavy lift rocket that's going to eventually take man further and faster into space to places that we haven't gone before, including asteroids and beyond the Earth-Moon cradle. Just yesterday, there's a $2 billion alpha magnetic spectrometer that we docked with the space station to unlock some of the biggest questions in science's search for dark matter and antimatter, finally really fulfilling the space station's goal as having a science component and turning it into a research lab that's orbiting 250 miles above us. That was something that was 15 years in the making. And NASA is taking us further into the solar system. Last month, the Messenger spacecraft went into orbit around Mercury. In a few weeks, Dawn, another spacecraft, is going to begin orbiting Vesta, which is the second most massive object in the asteroid belt. In August, Juno is going to take us all the way to Jupiter. This fall, the largest Mars rover, it's the size of a small car, is going to be lowered actually on a sky crane down onto the surface of Mars. And NASA is working on a Hubble replacement. This is another big program. It's seen some cost growth and some challenges. It's going to be several years off, but it'll allow us to see 10 times farther than the Hubble telescope and further back in time into ever before. But this new commercial space race has really been going gangbusters and has we've seen more results, I think, faster than we had expected, and it's just amazing progress. And last month, NASA just announced 4 new contracts for competitors ranging from, Boeing, Sierra Nevada, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and really these are the faces of this new frontier, where the commercial sector is stepping up. In this case, there's 4 different capsule vehicles. Some are lifting bodies, some are capsules, all competing. 2 rocket systems. There's the SpaceX's Falcon, and United Launch Alliance would serve 3 of, their Atlas V would serve 3 of the 4 potential capsules, and their Atlas V just made the 26th consecutive safe flight, likely to be a workhorse in this new area. On commercial cargo, something that the Bush administration launched for access to the space station, is moving along like gangbusters too. The Taurus II, a new rocket, is likely to have its first launch this summer. I think they're planning potentially on getting cargo all the way to the space station, or their Cygnus craft all the way to the space station later this year. We'll see if that works. SpaceX, likewise, is about to launch their first cargo mission all the way to the space station. And in suborbital space, another dynamic space where things are happening. Just last week, Virgin Galactic just had another breakthrough test. And as early as next year, I think we're going to see human spaceflight in the suborbital change. These are all, I think, big and dramatic things that are happening quickly and swiftly. It's a dynamic time, an exciting time, I think, to be in space. And I'm reminded that this is really only the beginning. I want to come back to this panel 20 years from now and see where we are. But this week marks the 50th anniversary of when JFK went to a joint session of Congress and said we want to go to the moon. And it launched our modern human space flight era. And I think it's exciting that we're still reaching for new heights 50 years later. That we're still at the beginning of unlocking what space can bring and the boundless opportunities that lie ahead. And, I frankly still think that the best is yet ahead. And with that, I want to go to Peter Marquez, who was instrumental within the Obama White House on helping us draft our national space strategy. Peter?
All right, well, first, thanks to David and Jeff for putting this panel together. For me, it's been great just to be able to sit here in the audience and just listen to what's happened and how we got to where we are. It's been fascinating for me, so I appreciate the opportunity. One thing I wanted to talk about really doesn't have to do with the content of policy or how we got there, but it's why. Why do you have a policy? At the White House, I used to be joked about with my colleagues on the NSC, we don't have a policy about this, we don't have a policy about that. There's no land policy, there's no air policy. Why the heck do you special nerds need a space policy? And the answer, in my opinion, is fairly clear. Space isn't a place. I mean, it is a place, but it's a lot more than that. It's everything. It's everywhere that we go. It's in everything that we do. If you go to the ATM, that's space. Check your email, space. Definitely space helped you get around. Even just the most arcane uses of space. I went skiing a few months ago with my father-in-law and my brother. Decided to load an app onto my phone that was able to track where I was, go down, show where I was on the ski trails, my speed, velocity, my elevation gained and lost, all this stuff, and then I was able to dump it on Google Earth and do a fly-through and see all the different trails I had skied. I'm sure that the Air Force had no idea that's how GPS was going to be abused, but it was sure fun to watch. So you look at, and then space with the way we do trade, warfare, modern warfare completely enabled by space, and intelligence programs and science efforts. Space is in everything we do. So if somebody says, why do we have a space policy, just ask them to pull out their phone or ask them if they checked what the weather was. It's everywhere, and that's why we need space policy. So I'm going to, I think Jim did a great job capturing the NASA activity. So what I want to do is really focus on how we developed the Obama space policy and some of the other content that was in there besides some of the scientific and NASA activities. Part of it was framed by my experience in the latter years of the Bush White House. There were a few activities that occurred in there that really shaped my opinions on how we should do the next administration's space policy. One of those is I came in right after the China ASAT test. I wouldn't really call it a test. I mean, when you blow something up on orbit, you really didn't test something, you did something. So that kind of changed the whole dynamic. Here was another country willing to exhibit that they were going to hold another nation's assets at risk, assets that we considered to be strategic, not just for nuclear deterrence, but in any type of warfare intelligence activity that we conducted. So it really was a shot across the bow that what we had thought had been a peaceful environment up to that point was now a threatened environment. That framed part of it. The other part is that the Bush policy had been put out in '06. I came in shortly after that and was told to go implement the policy. As we all know, we can all trace back failures in policy not because of the words that were written, but because of failures to implement the policy. When I got there, everybody said, hey, great to have you here, new guy. Clock's running out. We got other stuff to do. Good luck with implementing that policy. So trying to get the interagency together to go, oh yeah, you know what, let's go do this. Difficult, if not near impossible to do. Not a fault of the guys who wrote the policy. I think the policy is a fantastic policy. It was just a matter of timing. So part of that also shaped my desire to get a Obama policy out early. Other things that Brett touched on is that the changing environment of how space is utilized. The war on terror. Space was a strategic and tactical capability used often at the same exact time. And coalition warfare. Now, we had done coalition warfare since, before World War I. But things were different. People on the ground wearing different flags on their shoulders were getting the same data, relying on the same communications, relying on the same precision targeting to accomplish missions. And then one thing that also shaped it, and Jim touched on that, was the Constellation program and where we needed to go after that. Constellation program as a concept looked fine, looked great, and as Jim mentioned, the Augustine guy said, hey, it looks great on paper, seems to be doing well, but the way you're funding it, it's an unexecutable program, so we had to go and start over from there. And then another one was burnt frost, the USA 193 satellite engagement. That really was a defining moment for me. I'd been on the job just a few months, and you get a phone call that says, hey, the military thinks it wants to shoot down a satellite, and you think somebody in the sit room's having a joke with you. But that one, to me, everybody had mentioned the Obama White House is coming in with an idea of openness and transparency. I'll tell you, the seeds for openness and transparency as a key tenet of space policy were actually sown out of the USA 193 activity. As soon as the president made the decision that we were going to take down the satellite, there was not a question in the room that it was going to be an open kimono activity. We were going to share everything that we were doing, why we were doing it, the engagement profiles, everything there was that we could tell, we would show everybody in the world why we were doing it. And that came out of the Bush White House, and I think the Obama White House did a very faithful job in continuing on that idea of openness and transparency. So those were the things that, in my mind, shaped where we went on the national space policy. So one of the things that Jeff and David asked us to talk about were what changes were in the national space policies from previous administrations. One thing we did add was a chapeau, a lot of flowery language in the beginning. I'm not a big flowery, emotional guy. When they said, start putting together a chapeau, it was like, oh, I just want to write policy. Please just let me go do my job. Instead, they wanted poetry, and it just blew my mind. But really, in the end, it turned out to be a very helpful exercise because policy does serve two purposes. The one that we all normally care about is what guidance is it giving the U.S. government? What guidance is it giving to industry? What guidance is it giving to departments and agencies? The other thing that we often lose sight of is that policy is actually an external communications device. It tells other nations, tells other people what the U.S.'s intent is and what our goals and policy are. And I believe the chapeau in this national space policy sets that tone, sets the landscape, and tells everybody this is why we're doing space. This is why we do it. This is what we believe. And then the rest of policy goes out and says, this is how we're going to execute it. So I thought the chapeau was a nice addition to the document. The principles and goals, I think, as all my colleagues and predecessors have mentioned, those have stayed pretty much the same since the Eisenhower administration. One thing that was interesting, though, in the development of the Obama administration policy is maybe it was arrogance on my part. My friends would tell you that I have it in spades, but and those are just my friends. But I went in and briefed the senior leadership and said, here's our goals and here's our principles. And they said, that's fine that you think that, but why? I said, well, because we've been doing this since Eisenhower. I remember one person in the room, a very senior person, said, I don't care that Eisenhower said it. And they weren't being flipped, like, I don't care about Dwight Eisenhower, but it was more questioning, why are you doing these things? Why are they there? Why are these goals and why are these principles? And while the policies may have a lot of continuity, I will tell you that this administration went back and did a lot of soul searching as to why are these principles here? Do they still apply? Do they need to be updated? And you'll see that the core values remain. Some of the words have changed, but we actually went through a clean sheet approach and said, yeah, you know what? These principles are nearly universal, and they stood the test of time, and we did go back and take a very hard look at the goals and principles. Some other dramatic changes to the policy, in my opinion, was the ascendancy of the State Department's role in the policy. This was just a realization that space is an international activity now. The U.S. is not the only player. It's not multiple. It's not just the U.S. and the Soviet Union anymore. There's many players: commercial, non-state actors, industry. There are many other people that come into play, and we believe that the State Department needed a very strong role in working through that with us. And then one of them, it's just near and dear to my heart, was an explicit discussion of the role of GPS. It just acknowledges that there is that GPS really is a foundational piece of international infrastructure, and that there is starting to grow this interrelationship between cyber and space, and those that work both industries will tell you that the tie is very tight. And GPS is one of those enablers for the cyber domain. So just the fact that we're able to include GPS language at the national level I thought was important. So one thing I will go through is the process, how we got to the policy. This White House, I think most of you are familiar with the interagency process. I think Brett somewhat summarized it when he talked about the frustrations of developing two space transportation policies. Having 50 people in the room, all with 50 different opinions, sometimes those opinions reflect those of the departments and agencies that they represent, and sometimes they represent their own opinions. DalBello Dr. John Logsdon referred to my role in the Obama policy as a traffic cop, I would refer to it more as roadkill. People came with a lot of opinions, but once we figured out that the president was serious and we're going to have to start writing a policy, the mood changed. And I will tell you, it was one of the most exciting experiences of my life to sit in the room with a group of people who all had a similar goal in mind, all came to the table with their A game, left the emotion and religion at the door, save for a few folks, and really all worked together. It was one of the most enlightening experiences. I wish everybody here could, I wouldn't say spend several years at the White House, because I wouldn't wish that on a lot of people, but I wish you could spend one day there and just see the camaraderie and see the unity and vision. The process used in the Obama White House, I think, reflects a lot of the process that was used in previous White Houses, of the use of the PC and the DC process to get Principals Committee and Deputy Committee to get the issues on the table and have the senior leadership buy off on them. There was a campaign discussion in the Obama campaign about the reestablishment of the Space Council. We did actually have that discussion at the White House as to, well, do we need to reestablish the Space Council? And the discussion went something like this. Who's going to be on the Space Council? Well, following departments and agencies. Okay, and let me set the scene for you. We're sitting in the sit room with all the departments and agencies sitting around the table. And I pretty much said, well, this guy, that guy, this lady, okay. And what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about space issues. Okay. What are we doing here right now? Like, oh, okay. And the discussion was kind of, well, the process and the people were already in place. We're already sitting here talking about space things. Why do we need an additional space council on top of it? And as long as the system worked, I think that there wasn't a real strong need for a space council. And I think the system did work. We did put out a space policy in 18 months. One of my personal goals was to try to best Gil and get a space policy out before the Reagan administration did. And I think we beat the Reagan administration by just a couple of weeks. So, and speaking of which, Jim, I think everybody here has mentioned, we all stand on the shoulders of the guys who wrote the policy before us. And I will tell you, this is my own personal, not professional opinion, my gold standard was the Reagan administration policy. It took all the things that the Carter administration had put together. The Carter administration did a great job of taking all these disparate parts and putting it together. But the Reagan administration said, great, we now know what these parts are. How do we take it to the next step? How do we get out in front? And I will tell you that the Reagan administration policy sat on my desk during the entire writing of the space policy, dog-eared, underlined, scratched through, everything else. So if there's any failures in the Obama policy, no, it's a great policy, and I asked folks to go back and take a look at the Reagan policy, then go look at the Obama policy, and it's not one for one. There isn't a whole lot of textual similarity, but I think maybe you'll see some tone similarities there.
Hope and change.
Yes, sir. Hope and change. The actual writing of the policy took place in a matter of 5 months. Extraordinarily exciting time, painful at times. The policy writing phase was preceded by a presidential study directive known as PSD3. The president said, go study these areas and get back to me and tell me whether or not we need a space policy. I think when a president writes a study directive, says, tell me if we need to go rewrite a space policy, we kind of already know what that means. So the study directive was finished at the end of December. It was outbriefed at the end of December. Senior leadership took about a month to chew on it, and then in February they said, all right, get the crew together and let's start writing. So from February to the beginning of June, we wrote the National Space Policy. For those that have written national space policies, they will tell you that in order to write a policy in 5 months, it's hard. It's very hard. And there's only one way that gets done, is if everybody in the room worked together. And I had the greatest group of guys and ladies to work with on writing this national space policy. The other thing that we benefited from was extraordinary top-down guidance. And I don't mean there was micromanagement. What I meant is that the senior leadership, whether it was the secretaries or the vice president or the president, was very clear as to what they wanted out of space. A lot of time is wasted at the working level of trying to divine what the heck the bosses mean. And you can waste weeks. Somebody can write a line down and then the Talmudic interpretation begins as to what does that line really mean. But to have the senior leadership involved from the beginning really helped shorten the timeline for getting this policy out, and that was a critical role. So I think really that, I want to leave some time for questions. That was really the rundown of how we wrote the Obama policy. But that's just the national space policy. The rest is still being written. The implementation is still going on right now. So there's still a lot to, we'll come back 10 years from now and figure out whether or not it was a success or a failure. If it's a success, I'll be back. If not, I'll have my successor at the White House come back and say why it was a miserable failure. So I do think we tried to capture a lot of the issues. I think there are some really good successes, some good wins in there. I think we tried a real concerted effort to get the message out about the policy, did a lot of press releases and press engagements to make sure we did that. So we'll see. The rest is yet to be written on the Obama space policy. But I think we're on good footing because of the gentlemen who all came before me. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Well, not bad. Nearly 40 years of space policy in 2 hours and 40 minutes. I'm sure there's an enormous amount of questions for the panelists, but I will use the host prerogative to ask the first, and that concerns implementation. Peter mentioned it, others have mentioned it as the forum has gone on. The policies themselves are interesting exercises, and the processes and procedures that are put in place in order to draft them are fascinating to study. But in the reality of the implementation of those policies, the translation of an idea into thought and action, influencing budgets and programs, is where the rubber hits the road. So I would ask the panel to think about for a moment and comment on the implementation observations that they had from their various administrations. How did you see this policy get implemented, and where were the points of failure, if there were any, and how, if it did happen, did subsequent administrations improve upon or not recognize those lessons? And I invite anyone to jump in on that as they see fit. Steve.
Do we have to press a button? Nope. It's on. I'm Steve Moran from the Clinton administration. I'm sorry I had to step out for a phone call earlier, but I stepped out and missed the entire Clinton administration. But from an implementation perspective, I can talk about a good one and a bad one. GPS, I think it clearly is a good implementation of a good policy. We had that. We started that policy from scratch. There was nothing that preceded it, although I think Gilbert Rye didn't really take credit for Reagan's kind of offering GPS to the world in the follow-up to the loss of KAL 007. But we put the policy in place, and then we spent an inordinate amount of time, and a lot of time of Vice President Gore's, adding to that and making sure that that policy was going to stick and get implemented. We added the second and third civil signals. We put in place the financing package to make sure that was going to happen. We set in place the turning off selective availability and put in place the program with the military that would allow that to be turned off. We started all the international consultations on GPS, starting out with the European Commission and the Japanese. We had a joint at the President Clinton and Prime Minister Obuchi. I think we had a joint statement on GPS cooperation between the U.S. and Japan before we left. So that was a very good implementation of what I still think was a very strong and forward-leaning policy. And speaking of the policy process, if you look at one of the top goals in the first GPS policy, it says, I'm paraphrasing here, but it talks about enhancing economic competitiveness and productivity while protecting national security and foreign policy interests. I can tell you that every word of every space policy that ever comes out has been debated ad infinitum in the interagency process, and there were a lot of people who wanted that to be worded the other way around: enhance national security and foreign policy interests while protecting economic security and productivity. And it came out the way it did because as a reflection of the Clinton administration's focus on, is the economy stupid? And we knew the impact that policy was going to have on jobs, growth, productivity, technology, competitiveness, and all that. And I think that's reflected in the fact that the International Astronautical Federation this October is going to present a special 60th anniversary award for the single space program that has had the greatest impact on human lives. And that's coming from the international community, and that's going to be GPS. It'll be awarded to the GPS program. So that's a pretty important deal. I'll just use one word to talk about bad implementation of what maybe was a good policy, maybe not, to be determined in the future. And pose.
Questions from the floor? Sir?
Yeah, Rajiv Gopal from Hughes. So I would distinguish between outer space and inner space. And when we look at the space looking towards Earth, then communication, imaging, all these things become very relevant. So my question is, by not considering cyber and space together, are we missing something at the policy level? Because we talked about congestion, contested space, competitive space. Exactly same things apply to cyber also. And we know that both of these things have far reach. You can do a lot of things from remote distance. So should we have a more consolidated, integrated approach at policy level?
You know, if I can jump in on that, I mean, one of the things we did in our national space policy is we integrated our innovation strategy. We integrated our manufacturing strategy, our STEM education strategy, into our open government strategy, into the national strategy. And we talk a lot, there are so many parallels between cyberspace and outer space in terms of things that span borders and the kind of things. But I do think it's tough because at least in the cybersecurity space, which I also spent a lot of time on, the challenges are hugely different. And I would hate to move cybersecurity, which is a very fast-paced type of operation, into space policy, which by nature is very slow, changing dynamic. I think the cyberspace things takes a more dynamic, 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. And it requires interesting partnerships between the government and the private sector to be able to solve in outer space, even though there's a lot of linkages. I think if you combined the two structures and had it run by one, I think we would slow both efforts, frankly.
Yeah, if I could follow on as well. There's also a maturity level issue, right? So you've got folks here from Carter on up, but we're also missing the Eisenhower on up from there. We've been doing this for 50 plus years. We have a good idea as to what the space world looks like. We still have to evolve the dynamics, but cyber just isn't there yet. And to try to get those two to marry up is tough to do. Now, I will tell you that when we were writing especially the national security portions of the national space policy for Obama, it was informed by the guys on the cyber side. I spent a lot of time with the cyber folks working through this stuff so that we would at least have some cohesion and where the Venn diagrams overlapped, we would have good cohesion. But the cyber side just isn't there yet. I mean, I'll tell you, from a personal standpoint, the days it was tough being a space guy at the White House, I just say, at least I'm not a cyber guy. Sir?
Thank you. I don't think anybody in this room in 1989 would have been super impressed if I told you that we were going to be relying exclusively on the Russians to put us in space. I don't think anybody would have been particularly impressed with how costs have gone up, not down, even with things like lift. And industry has continued to struggle. It might be going in a good direction now, but it hasn't been, I don't think, a good 2 decades. I don't mean this is a partisan question because it's 20 years of both Republican and Democratic administrations, but what went wrong? I mean, specifically with policies, I think we can all agree that money's been scarce and interest has gone down. It's not the time of Apollo. But this hasn't been a good 2 decades. What did we do wrong? What policies, what choices did we not make, or what wrong choices did we make? I hope everybody can answer that.
I'll take a crack at that one. It's complicated. A part of it is, I think everything has been sort of said here in different administrations. It's very hard to stop something and start something new. The bargains you have to make in starting something new to get enough to overcome the inertia of doing nothing are so substantial. The interests and stakeholders have become so powerful and ingrained. To start something new is an overwhelming objective. You have to basically say, I need to fund everything that we're doing, and now I need to add more. And in a time of constrained budgets, really, as you listen going down the aisle here, there really wasn't anybody other than our friend with President Reagan, the sainted President Reagan, who seemed to have cash. And so that's part of it. The institutions have gotten old and bureaucratic. I hate to say that, but it's true. So the waxy buildup on implementation is just, as you roll down this, is just, I thought, I can't remember who said it, I guess Jim said it, when, the guys that ran Apollo were in their 20s, and the guys that are running the Shuttle space station are in their 50s. Enough said. And that's true when you look at the aerospace industries that are doing this and building this. We'll be able to see whether, I was country before country was cool. You go to SpaceX, there are a lot of young people, and Orbital, there are a lot of young people around, but the guys that are really doing it are 60. They're like retirees. They're past that, and they're going back and reliving old hits. So it's really a complicated problem. It's, I think, a huge problem in the space program. It is a huge problem for the United States space program moving forward. Can we become nimble? Can we become affordable? Can we become efficient and fast again in space, or is space just going to become the auto industry of the 21st century? Good question, complicated, and I'm not sure how we get out of it.
It does, I think, highlight the dependence of implementing the space program on the economy. In one sense, it's a miracle that any major program survives through this many administrations with the ups and downs of the economy. And I think that really highlights one of the contributions the commercial private sector space program is offering to the health of the space program. It wasn't too many years ago that Dave Thompson and I at Orbital formed a company called Orbital Imaging Corporation, and we really pioneered the commercialization of high-resolution imagery from space that you see now in what Peter and others refer to as the Google Earth and other things, and that's where policy can really be important in marshaling the resources of the government to helping the private sector capitalize on the entrepreneurship and the technology that's sitting out there, because the government cannot do it all itself. So we have to rely more and more on creativity and capturing the genius that this country has in meeting some of these goals for the future.
I'd certainly echo that. I think what the fundamental problem has been trying to do the same thing for too long. Because space programs are hard, because they're expensive, and also because we had such success early on. In 10 years, we went from nothing to landing on the moon and coming back, 12 years. We have, by contrast, operated the space shuttle and done the space shuttle since the mid-70s, first launch in '81, 30 years. It's a remarkable achievement, but it doesn't allow for dynamic growth or change or a learning curve where new folks come in, they design systems, they move on to design other systems. If you come in now, even on the national security side, you can work one program for 20 years instead of being in your late 20s in mission control for Apollo 11 and have worked Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and then to go on and do Skylab, shuttle, station. If we don't have a dynamic cycle that is more akin to the business cycle of, innovation, new product, 3 to 5 year time frame instead of 30 years, that's a problem. I think one of the things on the implementation of the vision for exploration that I did not like was that one of the drivers was, if we're going to go to Mars in 30 years, we have to design that vehicle now. Like if we're using the same vehicle 30 years from now to go to Mars, then we're fundamentally doing it wrong, in my view. And that's part of the, the lack of innovation, lack of dynamic activity, and you know, we've got to get out of that commercial crew, commercial cargo that was started under Administrator Griffin, and the commercial crew program now under this administration. Those can change that and allow NASA to do the bigger things that take longer, because that dynamic part of the sector will be there to inform it.
Let me add one point to that. Starting again on this end of the table, one of the things that has emerged over the actually decades that we're talking about in the space procurement arena has been an incredibly large and cumbersome bureaucratic procurement process. I mean, you look at when you try to offer a solution in the, whether it's come from a commercial provider, industrial provider of long standing, the oversight and the procurement requirements overlaid add incredible cost burden to these protracted procurements, whether it's a small instrument in space or a major procurement activity such as a space launch vehicle or space station. So it's the infrastructure that we've overlaid and required has been a significant contributor to that, and it's something that can be redressed and cut back. It's not a need-to requirement to have that overlaid over the process, in the space in particular.
So one last thing we tried to do, and it's subtly and sometimes not so subtly hidden into the Obama policy, was a reflection of what Art just mentioned, which is when we did the Presidential Study Directive 3, we were told to go look at the acquisition system and find out why it was broken. The report came back, and the report was surprising. The report was that the acquisition system is not broken. The acquisition system serves as a computer. If garbage goes into the system, garbage is coming out of the system. And what we found is that the requirements process and the program management was seriously flawed. Now, that's on the civil side and the national security side. The only place that seemed to be some glimmer of hope was on the commercial side. The commercial guys were doing things, and because they were driven on short timelines, had to have high technology refresh rate, and were driven by profit, which I don't have a problem with profit. There were things that were being done on the commercial side that should be harnessed by the government side. And that's why you saw the full embrace of commercial crew and cargo, which had been started in previous administrations. That's why you see the national security side, where it's appropriate, looking to service models to acquire services rather than platforms. The thing that suppresses programs is budget. There is nothing that suppresses the appetite of policy and requirements. And what we're trying to do is put some appetite suppression into the system.
I would be remiss if we didn't follow up on Mark's comment that our human space exploration program was dying a slow death. And in particular, at least the inference that I took away from it was that the end of the Cold War lifted the rationale for human spaceflight. And we've been struggling thereafter to find a new reason to do it, a new reason to animate support and initiatives and budgets behind it. So I would ask in particular Art and Gil to comment on the thinking of President Carter and President Reagan about the human spaceflight program. Did they see reasons to do it aside from the space race with the Soviet Union? And then perhaps some of the others might want to chime in about what they see as the ongoing rationale for human space exploration.
On the front end, let me comment, that was a driving force. Clearly, the aspirations of the nation to be a manned orbiting in orbit capability was a driving force for being first to do that with manned participation. However, there was also a high, well, even in the early years, high expectations that there would be a bigger role on the return of having man in space for the space station with industrial manufacturing and things of that nature, which unfortunately have not matured.
I think the President saw the manned space program as being the face of the space program. It's what gave visibility to the program. It's what got money on the Hill for the space program. It was hard, and it always has been hard, to rationalize the manned space program on the basis of its cost effectiveness, because it isn't. The military came to that conclusion back in the late 60s, they had a program called the Man Orbiting Laboratory that was eventually canceled in 1969. The military concluded that there was no mission in space that was needed to support the battlefield commanders that couldn't be done by an unmanned satellite system. And so when it came time for President Reagan to make the decision on the space station, Department of Defense said, we really don't have a vote here. We think you, Mr. President, ought to make the decision of what's in the best U.S. interest for other reasons, not for the military. So it's hard to argue with what Mark says, and it's a shame. It's a real shame that we can't do more, but the problem is that putting man in space is a very, very costly enterprise, and in a time when we got people on the Hill now arguing about how much we cut, not whether we cut, I wouldn't want to be a policy guy today in the White House. I think it would be kind of depressing, really, because I think it's a real heartbreak for those who have been involved in the space program, going all the way back to Mercury and Gemini, to see where we are now in a couple of months, ending what a string of programs that have been so important to our country. It's something to lament.
Can I take an alternative view? I do believe that we're at an exciting time, that we really are at just still the beginning of a bright new age of humans in space. I don't disagree with, I think, the precepts of the budget challenges that we face. Augustine Committee, for example, looked at why we do this and found that, for example, just on a scientific basis, it's not there. We can send robots and other places further out into space much more affordably and actually accomplish a lot more. There is something about U.S. leadership in space that's important. There's something about driving new technologies that lead to economic opportunity. But one of the things that I find that is incredibly exciting, and the reason why I think that there's a bright new future, is I look back at 1969. Two incredible governmental accomplishments in 1969. We landed on the moon, but we invented the internet. And one of the things that but they took two different fundamental paths. Now the internet is a bigger part of our economy than is space. Every day there's a dynamic new thing that's happening in the internet that is being discovered. There's an IPO yesterday, billions of dollars for LinkedIn, incredible things. But the difference is that in space we kept it entirely as a governmental program. And in the internet, around the 90s, we moved it. We created .com. And we moved it entirely out. It was no longer just .mil and .gov, but we created this new commercial space that could grow and thrive. And I do see exciting things around the corner that may not be government programs directly, but may be spurred on by new things that are enabled by this broader ecosystem. The fact that we've got companies like Bigelow who are working on a private space station with inflatable habitats. We don't know if they'll work, but they've got something up above right now. If they can, with one of the commercial crew, people get access to that's their primary problem, then it can become something new and different. In the suborbital space, we've got a lot of new entrants developing new things, new technologies that weren't possible before. And I think some of this, we also did a big move to prizes, and we've got some prizes that are happening now that people are doing some amazing things. If we can think outside of the box rather than a governmental program thinking about what we should do, we're trying to harness the experience of a broader set of Americans to figure out how to accomplish goals and other things. And so, while the inherently governmental piece is hard, and in our case, we are trying to focus NASA not on the low Earth orbit parts of it, but the harder stuff. I think it's really exciting. I think there is one other rationale for why we do some of these things, and and I look separately at the space station. I think it has a little different rationale for it. One of the things that I hadn't appreciated when I was serving in the Clinton administration, we went through some hard choices on bringing the Russians to the table and bringing other things. But when communications suddenly shut down, when there was a coup in Moscow, effectively, and all the communications channels had broken down, what actually was amazing was that the communication channels that had been built around the space station actually rose up and helped us create a back channel for communications to help move things forward. I do think that the international cooperation on some of this is extraordinarily valuable and underappreciated.
I'd like to make one point to echo first Jim's point about how this is an exciting time. And I think this goes back to what happened in the last 20 years, and to me, really, it's the last 40 years. But when we landed on the moon, those of us who grew up in those days, we were told, when you grow up, you get to fly in space. You're going to go to the moon, you're going to go to Mars. And the fact is, when we grew up, that didn't get to happen. It wasn't anywhere close unless you dedicated your life to being a pilot or a researcher, and you are the 1/10 of 1% of the people who apply that get selected as an astronaut. And the commercial human spaceflight activity that this administration has pushed, and that was, part of the vision for space exploration, part of the Aldrich Commission, that is the first thing that will change that equation. And that's the first time, people can say, well, maybe I get to go someday. First, it's going to be, very rich people, but those are people that didn't dedicate their lives to being astronauts. That's how aviation started. So as the price comes down, maybe I get to go someday. So I finally have come around to the view that I might actually get to fly in space sometime.
Well, I had hoped that we'd come to answers for all of the questions that had dogged space policy over the last 4 decades, but alas, we failed to achieve that goal. Nevertheless, we had a fascinating and stimulating discussion. I invite all of you to visit the website of TechAmerica, the Space Enterprise Council, for updates on the very good work that they're doing. For our part, at marshall.org, you can find copies of the declassified versions of all of the national space policies that we've been talking about today. They're there at a website called Making National Space Policy. We'll continue to update that archive as additional materials come out. I would ask that you all join me in thanking the panelists. They did a fantastic and excellent job. And thank you all for coming.
It's good to see you.
Enjoyed it. Great job.
I had a good let me come by and talk about
Fine job. Fine opportunity. Where are you?